Welcome to the inner sanctum of the human experience. You are currently drifting within the corridors of the most complex biological machine in the known universe. But today we aren't looking at the neurons or the synapses as mere electricity. We are looking at the colors they paint upon the canvas of your soul. Emotions. They are the invisible architects of our reality. They can build empires or burn them to the ground in a single heartbeat. From the fleeting shadow of a micro-expression to the generational weight of grief, feelings are the language the universe uses to speak to itself through you. Why does music make us weep? Why does the scent of rain bring back a decade-old memory? And what happens when the brain loses the ability to feel entirely? Tonight, we embark on an odyssey through 100 profound dimensions of human sentiment. We will bridge the gap between ancient philosophy and modern neurobiology to understand why you feel the way you do. Before we descend into the depths of the subconscious, take a moment to settle in. If you find peace in these deep dives, join our collective by subscribing to Midnight Molecules. A quick request for the algorithm. Let us know in the comments, from which corner of the globe are you watching and what time is it there? Your presence fuels this journey. Now, let the molecules of emotion guide you into the dark. Fact 1. The triune architecture of emotional processing. Within the labyrinthine corridors of human consciousness lies a three-tiered system governing our emotional existence. The reptilian brainstem, inherited from our most ancient ancestors, orchestrates primal fear responses and survival instincts with ruthless efficiency. Above this primitive foundation, the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, acts as the brain's emotional sentinel, processing threats and rewards in mere milliseconds before conscious awareness emerges. The prefrontal cortex, humanity's evolutionary crown jewel, attempts to regulate these older systems with varying degrees of success. This neural triumvirate constantly negotiates power, creating the emotional turbulence we experience daily. When the amygdala detects potential danger, it can hijack rational thought processes within 12 milliseconds, flooding our system with stress hormones before our conscious mind comprehends the threat. This ancient architecture explains why we sometimes feel before we think, why phobias persist despite logical understanding, and why emotional regulation remains one of humanity's most challenging endeavors. Understanding this tripartite system illuminates the fundamental conflict between our evolutionary heritage and modern psychological needs. Fact 2. Alexithymia, the silence where feelings should speak. Approximately 10% of humanity navigates existence with a peculiar condition called alexithymia, derived from Greek roots meaning, no words for emotions. These individuals experience feelings as undifferentiated physical sensations, a tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, without the accompanying psychological recognition of what emotion they're experiencing. Neuroimaging studies reveal reduced connectivity between the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula in alexithymic individuals, disrupting the integration of bodily sensations with emotional awareness. They describe their inner world as a fog, where others apparently perceive distinct emotional colors while they see only gray gradients. Social interactions become navigational nightmares. Without internal emotional guideposts, reading others' feelings becomes an intellectual exercise rather than intuitive understanding. Alexithymia frequently accompanies conditions like autism spectrum disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, suggesting trauma or neurodevelopmental differences can sever the connection between feeling and knowing. These individuals often excel in technical fields where emotional ambiguity poses less disadvantage, yet they suffer disproportionately from psychosomatic disorders, as unexpressed emotions manifest through physical symptoms their bodies cannot ignore. Fact 3. The oxytocin paradox, love's double-edged molecular sword. Popular science has crowned oxytocin the love hormone, yet this 9-amino acid peptide harbors a darker complexity that superficial accounts consistently overlook. While oxytocin indeed facilitates maternal bonding, romantic attachment, and social trust, recent research reveals its shadow function, amplifying in-group favoritism while intensifying out-group hostility. When administered to participants in controlled studies, oxytocin increased cooperative behavior toward perceived in-group members while simultaneously enhancing defensive aggression toward outsiders. This ancient neuropeptide, conserved across mammalian species for over 100 million years, doesn't simply promote universal love, it strengthens tribal boundaries. Oxytocin surges during childbirth, orgasm, and social bonding, creating powerful attachment through dopaminergic reward pathways. Yet this same molecule drives the fierce protectiveness that can manifest as xenophobia, the maternal aggression that makes new mothers hypervigilant, and the relationship jealousy that can curdle into possessiveness. Neurons in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus synthesize this powerful molecule, which then influences behavior through receptors distributed throughout the limbic system. Understanding oxytocin's dual nature reveals that evolution crafted not a simple love potion, but a sophisticated chemical that binds groups together partly through defining who remains outside those bonds. Fact 4. Emotional contagion, the invisible transmission of feeling states. Human beings are involuntary emotional broadcasters and receivers, constantly transmitting and absorbing affective states through mechanisms operating beneath conscious awareness. Within 20 milliseconds of observing another person's facial expression, mirror neurons in the premotor cortex and inferior parietal lobule fire in patterns that simulate the observed emotion, creating a neural template of their feeling state within our own brain architecture. This automatic mimicry extends beyond facial expressions to posture, vocal tone, and even breathing patterns, creating what psychologists term emotional contagion, the phenomenon where moods spread through social networks like invisible pathogens. Studies tracking mood propagation through social media platforms reveal that emotional states can transmit across 3 degrees of separation, affecting friends of friends of friends without direct contact. The amygdala and anterior insula integrate these mirrored patterns with our own emotional history, generating vicarious feelings that sometimes become indistinguishable from self-generated emotions. This mechanism served evolutionary purposes, enabling rapid group coordination during threats and facilitating empathic understanding. However, in modern contexts, it renders us vulnerable to collective mood disturbances, explains the exhaustion of frontline healthcare workers absorbing patient suffering, and illuminates why sustained exposure to others' distress can trigger secondary traumatization. Fact 5. L'appel du vide, the call of the void's unsettling whisper. Standing at cliff edges or high balconies, many people experience a disturbing phenomenon, a sudden intrusive urge to jump, despite harboring no suicidal intent. The French term l'appel du vide, the call of the void, captures this uncanny experience better than any clinical designation. Researchers estimate that approximately 50% of people have experienced this bizarre impulse at least once, representing not a death wish but rather a misfire in our survival circuitry. The brain's safety monitoring system, constantly scanning for threats, generates a powerful fear response to dangerous heights. This alarm signal sometimes gets misinterpreted by our conscious mind, which confuses the intense fear of falling with an actual desire to fall. The confusion arises from the gap between our automatic threat detection systems and our slower conscious interpretation mechanisms. Some evolutionary psychologists propose that these intrusive thoughts served an adaptive purpose, making our ancestors more cautious around precipices by vividly illustrating the consequences of carelessness. The phenomenon extends beyond physical voids to metaphorical ones, sudden urges to swerve into oncoming traffic, to say something shocking during solemn moments, or to destroy carefully constructed work. These intrusive thoughts reveal the sometimes adversarial relationship between different processing systems within our minds, where safety mechanisms occasionally generate the very scenarios they're designed to prevent. Fact 6. The emotional granularity hypothesis, precision in feeling vocabulary. Psychological research reveals a striking correlation between emotional vocabulary sophistication and mental health outcomes, a relationship termed emotional granularity. Individuals who possess rich, nuanced language for distinguishing between similar feeling states, differentiating between anxiety, nervousness, apprehension, and dread rather than collapsing them into generic bad feelings, demonstrate superior emotional regulation and lower rates of depression and anxiety disorders. Neuroimaging studies show that high-granularity individuals exhibit more efficient connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and limbic structures, suggesting that linguistic precision actually rewires neural architecture. When we can precisely label an emotion, we activate different neural networks than when we experience only undifferentiated distress. This linguistic specificity enables more targeted coping strategies. Someone who recognizes they're experiencing guilt rather than general upset can address the specific cognitive patterns maintaining that guilt. Language literally shapes our emotional reality by determining which feeling states our consciousness can distinguish. Cultures with extensive emotional vocabularies, such as German with Schadenfreude or Japanese with aware, provide their members with cognitive tools for recognizing and navigating specific emotional terrains. Conversely, emotional vocabulary restriction, common in certain masculine socialization patterns, correlates with poorer mental health outcomes, as individuals lack the linguistic scaffolding necessary for emotional self-understanding. Fact 7. The neuroscience of musical frisson, skin orgasms and auditory pleasure. Certain musical passages trigger an extraordinary psychophysiological response. Waves of chills cascading across the skin, hair standing erect, a shuddering pleasure radiating through the body, a phenomenon researchers term musical frisson or aesthetic chills. Approximately 2/3 of the population experiences this response, which involves a complex symphony of neurotransmitter releases. When anticipated patterns in music are unexpectedly violated, a sudden key change, an unanticipated silence, a vocalist's entrance, the brain's reward circuitry releases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, while simultaneously triggering the autonomic nervous system to create the characteristic piloerection response. Functional MRI studies reveal activation cascades connecting the auditory cortex to emotional processing regions, including the amygdala, ventral striatum, and orbitofrontal cortex. Remarkably, the brain treats these moments of aesthetic transcendence with neurochemical machinery originally evolved for far more pragmatic purposes. The dopamine release mechanism that rewards food acquisition or sexual opportunity now responds to abstract patterns of organized sound. Individual differences in frisson frequency correlate with personality traits like openness to experience and with specific structural variations in neural connectivity. Those who regularly experience musical chills possess denser connections between auditory processing regions and emotional centers, suggesting that repeated aesthetic experiences literally reshape brain architecture, creating dedicated neural highways for beauty-induced transcendence. Fact 8. Nostalgic architecture, memory's bittersweet emotional reconstruction. Nostalgia, long dismissed as psychological weakness or maudlin sentimentality, has emerged as a sophisticated emotional mechanism serving crucial adaptive functions. This bittersweet longing for the past activates a distributed neural network spanning the hippocampus, where autobiographical memories reside, and the prefrontal cortex, which reconstructs these fragments into coherent narratives suffused with emotional coloring. Nostalgia serves as a psychological immune system, providing comfort during present distress by accessing periods of security and meaning. Studies demonstrate that induced nostalgia increases feelings of social connectedness, enhances optimistic orientation toward the future, and buffers against existential anxiety. However, the memory's nostalgia accesses are fundamentally reconstructive rather than reproductive. We don't replay the past but rather rebuild it, systematically editing out the discomforts and amplifying the pleasures, creating a sanitized version that never quite existed. This emotional photoshopping serves psychological needs by providing an internal reservoir of positive self-concept and social belonging. The distinctive bittersweetness of nostalgia, simultaneous pleasure and loss, arises from our simultaneous awareness of past joy and its irrecoverable nature. Cultural differences shape nostalgic content and frequency. Collectivist societies tend toward social nostalgia emphasizing relationships and shared experiences, while individualist cultures generate more personal achievement-focused nostalgic narratives. Modern consumer capitalism deliberately weaponizes nostalgia through retro marketing, exploiting this emotional mechanism for commercial purposes. Fact 9. The facial feedback hypothesis, muscles that manufacture mood. The relationship between facial expressions and emotional experience operates bidirectionally in ways that challenge common-sense assumptions about causality. While we typically assume internal feelings generate external expressions, compelling evidence demonstrates that facial muscle configurations can actually induce corresponding emotional states, a phenomenon termed the facial feedback hypothesis. When participants are induced to smile, even by holding a pencil between their teeth to mechanically engage the zygomatic major muscles, they report increased positive effect and find cartoons funnier than control groups. Conversely, preventing frowning through botulinum toxin injections demonstrably reduces the intensity of negative emotional experiences, with implications for treating depression. This mechanism operates through interoceptive feedback loops. Proprioceptive neurons in facial muscles send signals to the somatosensory cortex, which integrates this information with emotional processing centers in the limbic system. The brain essentially asks, "If I'm smiling, should I feel happy?" and adjusts internal states accordingly. This discovery has spawned therapeutic interventions encouraging deliberate manipulation of expressive behavior to regulate emotional experience. However, chronic suppression of authentic expression creates psychological costs, as the continuous discordance between internal states and external displays generates what emotion researchers term emotional labor. Cultural display rules dictate which expressions are acceptable in which contexts, forcing individuals into perpetual facial management that can exhaust regulatory resources and contribute to burnout, particularly in service industries requiring constant emotional performance. Fact 10. Jungian shadow integration, befriending the disowned self. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow represents one of depth psychology's most profound insights into emotional wholeness. Those aspects of ourselves we find unacceptable, rage, lust, selfishness, aggression, don't disappear through denial but rather sink into unconscious regions where they accumulate power and periodically erupt in destructive ways. The shadow comprises all the qualities we've rejected to maintain our conscious self-concept, creating what Jung termed a splinter psyche, operating autonomously. This disowned material doesn't remain passive but actively influences behavior through projection. We attribute our own unacknowledged qualities to others, experiencing them as external threats rather than internal realities. A person who has repressed their own aggression might perceive the world as hostile and threatening, while someone denying their sexuality might become preoccupied with others' sexual behavior. Jung proposed that psychological maturation requires shadow integration, consciously acknowledging these disowned aspects without necessarily acting on them, thereby reclaiming the psychic energy bound up in repression. Neuroscience provides supporting evidence through studies showing that emotional suppression requires continuous prefrontal cortex activation to inhibit amygdala responses, consuming metabolic resources and reducing overall regulatory capacity. Shadow work involves confronting projections, recognizing patterns in our emotional triggers, and accepting the full spectrum of human impulses within ourselves. This integration doesn't mean indulging destructive impulses but rather removing their autonomy by bringing them into consciousness, where they can be acknowledged without controlling behavior. Fact 11. The physiology of grief, heartbreak's literal manifestation. Grief transcends mere metaphor when it manifests as broken heart syndrome, a legitimate medical condition where intense emotional distress triggers cardiac symptoms indistinguishable from heart attacks. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, its medical designation, involves stress hormone surges so overwhelming that they temporarily stun the left ventricle, causing it to balloon into a distinctive shape resembling a Japanese octopus trap. The neurophysiology of grief reveals why loss feels physically painful. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes social rejection and bereavement, overlaps substantially with neural networks processing physical pain. Brain scans of grieving individuals show activation patterns remarkably similar to those experiencing bodily injury, explaining why we describe emotional wounds using physical pain terminology. This neural overlap represents an evolutionary adaptation. Social bonds became so crucial to human survival that their rupture triggers the same alarm systems as physical threats. Grief follows a predictable neurochemical trajectory. Initial shock involves stress hormone flooding that creates the numb, dissociative state bereaved individuals describe. Subsequent waves of yearning correlate with dopamine and oxytocin fluctuations as the brain's reward system searches for the lost attachment figure. Eventual acceptance requires the gradual pruning of neural representations maintaining the bond. Cultural variation in grief expression, from Irish wakes to Victorian mourning etiquette, shapes these universal neurobiological processes through different ritualized channels, demonstrating how cultural practices scaffold raw biological responses into socially meaningful experiences. Fact 12. Microexpressions, the truthful flicker beneath social masks. Human faces leak emotional truth through involuntary muscular contractions lasting between 40 and 200 milliseconds. Microexpressions too brief for conscious control yet sufficiently distinct for trained observers to decode. Psychologist Paul Ekman's pioneering research identified 7 universal emotional expressions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, surprise, and contempt, that appear across cultures with sufficient consistency to suggest biological rather than learned origins. These fleeting facial configurations arise when emotional responses momentarily overwhelm social display rules before conscious suppression reasserts control. The neural basis involves dual pathways: a fast subcortical route from the amygdala directly to facial motor nuclei, creating automatic emotional expressions, and a slower cortical pathway through prefrontal regions that can inhibit or modify these expressions according to social appropriateness. Microexpressions emerge during the temporal gap between these pathways, revealing authentic feelings before social masks slip back into place. Ekman developed training programs enabling individuals to recognize these fleeting signals, finding applications in security screening, therapeutic practice, and negotiation contexts. However, the reliability of microexpression detection remains controversial. While laboratory studies demonstrate above-chance accuracy, real-world validation proves more elusive. Cultural differences, individual variation in expressiveness, and the context-dependent nature of emotional meaning complicate simplistic lie detection applications. Nevertheless, the existence of microexpressions illuminates the constant negotiation between authentic emotional experience and socially modulated presentation that characterizes human interaction. Fact 13. The emotional valence of scent, olfaction's memory superhighway. Among sensory modalities, olfaction maintains unique neural architecture that explains why certain smells trigger overwhelming emotional memories with startling vividness, a phenomenon termed the Proustian effect, after Marcel Proust's famous Madeleine passage. Unlike other senses, olfactory information bypasses the thalamic relay station and projects directly to the amygdala and hippocampus, the brain's emotional and memory centers respectively. This neuroanatomical arrangement, preserved from evolutionary history when smell detection was crucial for survival, means sense access emotional memory systems with minimal cognitive mediation. The piriform cortex processes odor identification while simultaneously activating the amygdala's emotional coloring and the hippocampus's contextual memory formation, creating multisensory memory traces that are unusually resistant to degradation. Consequently, a whiff of a grandmother's perfume or the scent of ocean air can instantaneously transport consciousness to childhood moments with an emotional intensity that visual or auditory cues rarely match. This mechanism operates largely beneath conscious awareness. The emotional response often precedes conscious identification of the triggering odor. Marketing industries exploit this vulnerability, infusing retail environments with carefully engineered scents designed to evoke positive associations and prolong shopping duration. The olfactory bulb, despite being the only externalized brain structure directly exposed to the external environment, remains remarkably poorly understood compared to other sensory systems, largely because odor qualities resist the dimensional analysis possible with visual or auditory stimuli. Fact 14. Emotional asymmetry in neural architecture, the right hemisphere's affective dominance. The brain's two hemispheres process emotional information with striking asymmetry, a lateralization that profoundly influences affective experience. While popular psychology's simplistic left brain/right brain dichotomy grossly oversimplifies neural reality, genuine functional asymmetries exist in emotional processing. The right hemisphere demonstrates dominance for emotional perception, prosodic interpretation, and processing of facial expressions, while also maintaining preferential connections to the autonomic nervous system that generates bodily emotional responses. Patients with right hemisphere damage frequently exhibit emotional flattening and impaired recognition of others' feelings, even when language and logical reasoning remain intact. More subtly, evidence suggests that the right hemisphere specializes in processing negative emotions, particularly withdrawal-related affects like sadness and fear, while the left hemisphere preferentially processes approach-related positive emotions. This valence hypothesis proposes that the two hemispheres regulate different motivational orientations, the left facilitating engagement with the environment, the right promoting caution and withdrawal. Anterior regions demonstrate the strongest lateralization. Left prefrontal activation correlates with positive effect and behavioral approach, while right prefrontal activity associates with negative effect and withdrawal. Individual differences in baseline hemispheric activation patterns predict temperamental variation, with relatively greater left frontal activation characterizing dispositionally positive individuals. However, emotional asymmetry shouldn't be reified as absolute. Complex emotional experiences recruit bilateral networks, and the degree of lateralization varies considerably across individuals and contexts. Fact 15. The phenomenology of awe, vastness dissolving the self. Awe represents a complex emotional state triggered by encountering something vast, whether in scale, complexity, or conceptual magnitude, that transcends current mental schemas and necessitates cognitive accommodation. This powerful emotion, traditionally associated with religious experiences and natural wonders, activates a distinctive neural signature involving the default mode network's temporary disruption, particularly in regions supporting self-referential processing. The subjective experience of awe involves a characteristic, small self feeling, a diminishment of individual concerns and ego boundaries accompanied by a sense of connection to something larger. Psychophysiological studies document A's unique signature. Piloerection, changes in time perception where moments seem to expand, activation of the sympathetic nervous system producing heightened arousal, yet simultaneously decreased pro-inflammatory cytokine production, suggesting immune system benefits. Researchers distinguish between threat-based awe, such as witnessing devastating natural forces, and beauty-based awe, like viewing sublime artworks or cosmic imagery. Both variants share the accommodation requirement. The mind must expand existing conceptual frameworks to assimilate the overwhelming stimulus, but differ in their hedonic tone and action tendencies. Frequent awe experiences correlate with increased prosocial behavior, reduced materialism, greater life satisfaction, and enhanced critical thinking as mental rigidity loosens. Modern life's diminished exposure to genuinely awesome stimuli, replaced by algorithmically optimized entertainment designed to capture attention without transcending it, may constitute an under-recognized mental health risk, depriving consciousness of crucial perspective-shifting experiences. Fact 16. Emotional labor and display rules, the exhaustion of performing feeling. Every social interaction requires some degree of emotional performance, modulating authentic internal states to meet contextual appropriateness standards that sociologists term display rules. However, occupations requiring sustained emotional labor, where workers must consistently generate or suppress specific feelings as explicit job requirements, exact measurable psychological costs. Flight attendants maintaining cheerfulness through passenger abuse, nurses projecting calm competence while managing their own distress, debt collectors generating aggressive intimidation despite personal discomfort. All engage in what sociologist Arlie Hochschild termed deep acting, where individuals attempt to actually experience the required emotions rather than merely faking expressions. This sustained emotion regulation depletes cognitive resources through continuous prefrontal cortex engagement to override authentic limbic responses. Neuroimaging studies reveal that suppressing emotional expression requires active inhibition measurable through increased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and decreased amygdala activity, a pattern associated with ego depletion effects. Workers experiencing chronic emotional dissonance, sustained discrepancy between felt and displayed emotions, demonstrate elevated burnout rates, higher incidences of psychological distress, and increased cardiovascular disease risk. Cultural display rules vary dramatically. Japanese Tateme, public facade, versus Han, true feelings, distinction codifies this split, while American culture's relentless positivity mandate creates what sociologists call toxic positivity. The pandemic's Zoom-mediated interactions intensified emotional labor requirements, as workers struggled to project engagement while managing domestic chaos and personal anxiety just off-screen. Fact 17. The neurotransmitter symphony, serotonin's subtle emotional modulation. Serotonin, the neurotransmitter targeted by most antidepressant medications, functions less like an on-off happiness switch and more like a sophisticated modulator shaping how the brain processes emotional information. Approximately 90% of the body's serotonin exists in the gut, orchestrating digestive processes, while the remaining 10% operates within the central nervous system, where it influences mood, anxiety, cognition, and numerous other functions. Serotonergic neurons originating in the raphe nuclei of the brainstem project throughout the brain, releasing this monoamine neurotransmitter to over a dozen distinct receptor subtypes, each triggering different downstream effects. Rather than simply causing happiness or sadness, serotonin appears to modulate emotional processing biases. Adequate serotonin levels promote attention to positive stimuli and rewarding outcomes while reducing sensitivity to punishment and negative information. Depression may therefore represent not merely serotonin deficiency but rather a shift in emotional information processing where aversive stimuli capture disproportionate attention. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors work not by immediately increasing happiness but by gradually recalibrating these processing biases over weeks as neuroplasticity allows new patterns to consolidate. Individual genetic variations in serotonin transporter genes influence baseline mood and stress vulnerability, with the short allele variant associated with increased amygdala reactivity to threatening stimuli. Dietary tryptophan, serotonin's amino acid precursor, influences brain serotonin synthesis, providing a mechanism whereby nutrition affects mood, though direct supplementation rarely achieves therapeutic effects due to complex regulatory systems. Fact 18. Cultural variations in emotional vocabulary, language sculpting feeling. Human languages differ dramatically in their emotional lexicons, not merely in translation but in actually carving different conceptual spaces within the continuous spectrum of affective experience. German Schadenfreude, pleasure derived from others' misfortune, names a feeling most cultures experience but many languages lack precise terms for, demonstrating how vocabulary shapes emotional awareness. Japanese distinguishes ame, a particular feeling of pleasurable dependence on another's indulgence, from general affection or neediness, a differentiation reflecting cultural emphasis on interdependence. The Inuit people possess numerous distinct terms for varieties of anger depending on whether it's justified, sudden, slowly building, or directed at spirits versus people, creating an emotional granularity foreign to English's relatively undifferentiated anger category. Portuguese saudade describes a melancholic longing for absent people, places, or eras, tinged with beauty and awareness that what's missed might never have existed as remembered, a culturally specific feeling emerging from Portugal's historical relationship with exploration and loss. These linguistic differences aren't merely naming conventions but actually shape emotional experience through the psychological principle of linguistic relativity. Research demonstrates that bilinguals report experiencing emotions differently depending on which language they're using, suggesting language actively constructs rather than passively describes emotional reality. Emotion concepts emerge through complex interactions between neurophysiological substates and cultural meaning-making systems, producing genuine cross-cultural variation in emotional life despite universal biological substrates. Modern globalization and linguistic homogenization may therefore impoverish humanity's collective emotional range by eliminating culturally specific feeling concepts. Fact 19. The neuroscience of compassion fatigue, empathy's resource depletion. Healthcare workers, therapists, and others professionally exposed to sustained suffering frequently experience compassion fatigue, a distinctive form of burnout characterized by diminished empathic capacity, emotional numbing, and paradoxical indifference towards suffering. This phenomenon involves measurable neurobiological changes rather than mere psychological weakness. Chronic empathic engagement without adequate recovery activates the brain's pain and distress networks repeatedly, creating what neuroscientists term empathic distress. Sustained anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex activation, regions processing both physical pain and vicarious suffering, leads to dysregulation in stress response systems. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis becomes hyperactive, flooding the system with cortisol, while simultaneously the brain's reward systems show blunted responses, reducing the satisfaction normally derived from helping behaviors. Fascinatingly, contemplative neuroscience research distinguishes between empathy and compassion as neurologically distinct processes. While empathy involves sharing others' suffering through resonance networks, compassion activates different circuitry associated with positive affect, caregiving, and approach motivation. Training in compassion meditation, generating warm feelings towards suffering beings rather than merely resonating with their pain, activates reward-related ventral striatum and prefrontal regions while down-regulating empathic distress networks. This neurological distinction suggests that sustainable caregiving requires cultivating compassion's approach motivation rather than empathy's resonance suffering. Organizations increasingly recognize that supporting workers' emotional resilience isn't luxury but necessity for maintaining both humanitarian effectiveness and individual well-being. Fact 20. The emotional Stroop effect, when feelings hijack cognition. The emotional Stroop task reveals how affective content can overwhelm cognitive control, demonstrating emotion's profound interference with supposedly rational processing. In standard Stroop tasks, participants struggle to name the ink color of words when the word itself names a different color. Reading blue, printed in red ink requires effortful inhibition of the automatic reading response. The emotional variant presents neutral versus emotionally salient words, finding that threatening, trauma-related, or personally relevant emotional content dramatically slows color naming compared to neutral words. This interference reflects involuntary attention capture by emotional stimuli, measurable through both behavioral slowing and neural activity patterns. The amygdala and ventral attentional networks automatically orient toward emotionally significant stimuli, hijacking processing resources away from the task at hand. In individuals with anxiety disorders, threatening words produce especially pronounced interference effects. PTSD sufferers show dramatic slowing for trauma-related content. Depressed individuals demonstrate interference for negative self-referential words. These patterns reveal how clinical emotional disturbances involve not just subjective distress but fundamental alterations in information processing architecture. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex activate during successful emotional Stroop performance, reflecting the cognitive control required to override emotional hijacking. Individual differences in emotional interference correlate with real-world emotion regulation abilities, making the emotional Stroop a valuable tool for understanding clinical pathology and treatment response. This paradigm exemplifies how seemingly simple laboratory tasks can illuminate the continuous negotiation between emotional and cognitive systems characterizing moment-to-moment consciousness. Fact 21. Emotional memory consolidation: how feelings become permanent. Emotionally arousing experiences demonstrate superior memory retention compared to neutral events, a phenomenon with profound implications for understanding trauma, nostalgia, and identity formation. The neurobiology underlying this emotional enhancement of memory involves stress hormone modulation of consolidation processes during the hours following an experience. When significant events trigger amygdala activation, this almond-shaped structure releases norepinephrine locally while signaling the adrenal glands to release stress hormones including cortisol and epinephrine. These hormones cross the blood-brain barrier and potentiate synaptic consolidation in the hippocampus, essentially tagging emotionally significant memories for preferential strengthening. This mechanism evolved to ensure survival-relevant information. Locations of dangers, sources of food, social alliance violations, received prioritized storage. However, the system cannot distinguish between adaptively important emotional arousal and maladaptive distress, explaining why traumatic memories become pathologically consolidated. The amygdala's involvement means emotional memories incorporate not just factual content but also the feeling states present during encoding, causing memory retrieval to reactivate associated emotions. This emotional reactivation can be triggered by peripheral cues, a smell, a sound, a facial expression, that weren't consciously noted during the original experience but were nevertheless encoded. Sleep plays a crucial role in emotional memory processing. REM sleep appears particularly important for integrating emotional experiences while simultaneously reducing their effective charge, a process disrupted in PTSD. Understanding emotional memory mechanisms has spawned therapeutic interventions targeting memory reconsolidation, attempting to update traumatic memories during the brief window after retrieval when they become labile. Fact 22. The paradox of hedonic adaptation: why joy fades. Human emotional systems demonstrate remarkable adaptive properties that create a perplexing psychological paradox. Virtually all emotional states, whether positive or negative, tend toward baseline neutrality over time through hedonic adaptation. Lottery winners, after an initial euphoria period, typically return to approximately their pre-windfall happiness levels within months. Conversely, individuals who experience devastating losses, paraplegia from accidents, business failures, relationship dissolutions, also generally return toward emotional baseline, though often with residual deficits in specific life domains. This adaptation reflects fundamental properties of neural reward circuits, particularly dopamine systems that respond more powerfully to changes in circumstances than to absolute states. The ventral striatum and nucleus accumbens activate intensely when rewards exceed predictions but habituate rapidly to predictable positive outcomes. This mechanism served evolutionary purposes, motivating continued striving rather than complacent stasis once resources were secured. However, hedonic adaptation creates a frustrating hedonic treadmill, where people perpetually chase satisfaction that dissipates upon achievement. The implications for human flourishing are profound. Pursuing happiness through circumstantial improvements yields disappointing returns as adaptation erodes gains. Certain life domains resist adaptation more than others. Social connection quality and meaningful work show less complete adaptation than material wealth or physical circumstances. Deliberately cultivating gratitude, savoring positive experiences through mindful attention, and introducing variety all represent strategies for combating adaptation's erosive effects. Understanding hedonic adaptation also illuminates why societies don't become progressively happier despite dramatic increases in material prosperity. The psychological baseline simply recalibrates upward. Fact 23. Emotional intelligence: navigating the social world's feeling currents. The concept of emotional intelligence, popularized despite ongoing debates about its scientific validity, attempts to capture individual differences in emotional perception, understanding, and management. Psychologists distinguish between ability-based emotional intelligence, measurable capacities like accurately identifying facial expressions or predicting emotional consequences, and trait-based emotional intelligence, which encompasses self-reported emotional tendencies and competencies. High emotional intelligence individuals demonstrate superior performance across numerous domains, more satisfying relationships, better workplace outcomes, enhanced psychological well-being, and even improved physical health. The neurological substrate underlying emotional intelligence involves efficient integration between emotional processing regions like the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex, and regulatory regions in the prefrontal cortex, allowing appropriate emotional responsiveness balanced with control. Genetic factors contribute substantially to emotional intelligence, with twin studies suggesting heritability around 40%, though substantial environmental shaping occurs through childhood attachment experiences and social learning. Cultural context profoundly influences which emotional competencies receive valuation. Western individualistic cultures prize emotional expression and self-assertion, while Eastern collectivist cultures emphasize emotional restraint and interpersonal harmony. Critics argue that emotional intelligence represents a repackaging of existing personality dimensions like agreeableness and emotional stability rather than a distinct construct. Nevertheless, the concept's intuitive appeal, that understanding and managing emotions constitutes a genuine form of intelligence beyond mere IQ, resonates with widespread recognition that purely cognitive abilities insufficiently predict success in domains requiring social navigation, self-motivation, and interpersonal influence. Fact 24. The biological basis of intuition, somatic markers guide decision-making. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis proposes that emotional bodily signals, gut feelings, constitute crucial information sources for decision-making, challenging purely rational models of judgment. According to this framework, when facing decisions, the brain rapidly reactivates patterns of bodily states associated with similar past situations, creating subtle physiological signals that bias choice before conscious deliberation completes. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrates these somatic markers, connecting cognitive representations of options with their associated emotional and physiological consequences. Patients with damage to this region demonstrate preserved intellectual function yet make catastrophically poor real-world decisions, particularly in social and financial domains. In laboratory gambling tasks, these patients fail to develop the anticipatory skin conductance responses that healthy participants show before making disadvantageous choices, essentially lacking the gut feeling warning that guides behavior. This finding suggests that purely rational deliberation, divorced from emotional signaling, proves insufficient for navigating complex decisions with uncertain outcomes and delayed consequences. The somatic marker system operates largely unconsciously, creating the subjective experience of intuition, knowing without knowing how we know. This mechanism evolved in environments where rapid action based on pattern recognition meant survival, allowing quick decisions without exhaustive analysis. However, somatic markers can mislead when bodily signals reflect irrelevant associations or irrational fears, explaining why people sometimes experience powerful intuitions that prove entirely wrong. Effective decision-making requires integrity. Fact 25. Cultural display rules, the social choreography of feeling. Every culture maintains implicit rules governing which emotions should be expressed, suppressed, or modified in particular social contexts, what anthropologists term display rules. These cultural regulations shape not just expression but actual emotional experience through lifelong socialization. American culture's emphasis on positive affect and individual emotional authenticity contrasts sharply with Japanese cultural norms valuing emotional restraint and contextual appropriateness over personal expression. Research documenting these differences finds that Japanese participants display fewer facial expressions during emotional film clips when an authority figure is present, while American participants show minimal suppression. These aren't merely superficial differences in expression but reflect deeper cultural models of selfhood and relationality. Collectivist cultures that emphasize interdependence and harmony develop display rules prioritizing others' comfort over personal emotional expression, while individualistic cultures that privilege autonomy and authenticity encourage emotional expression as healthy and authentic. Children acquire their culture's display rules through observation, explicit instruction, and conditioning, internalizing them so thoroughly that they become automatic. The prefrontal cortex mediates conscious application of display rules, explaining why frontal lobe damage can result in socially inappropriate emotional expression. However, chronic suppression of emotions to meet cultural demands exacts psychological costs, particularly when display rules conflict with genuine feeling states. Gender-based display rules operate within cultures, with boys socialized toward emotional stoicism except for anger, while girls receive encouragement for expressing sadness and fear but face disapproval for aggression. These gendered emotional socialization patterns contribute to sex differences in mental health presentations. Fact 26. The neurochemistry of social rejection. Why exclusion hurts. Social exclusion and rejection trigger neural and neurochemical responses remarkably similar to physical pain, revealing the deep evolutionary integration of social belonging into basic survival systems. When participants experience ostracism in the cyberball paradigm, a simple virtual ball toss game where other players suddenly exclude them, neuroimaging reveals activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, the same regions processing physical pain's unpleasantness. This neural overlap explains why social pain and physical pain share vocabulary. We speak of hurt feelings, broken hearts, and being crushed by rejection using literal pain terminology. The evolutionary logic underlying this system recognizes that for deeply social species like humans, exclusion from the group historically meant death through predation or resource scarcity. Consequently, natural selection crafted social pain mechanisms piggybacking on existing physical pain systems to motivate behaviors maintaining social bonds. The opioid system modulates both physical and social pain, administering naltrexone, which blocks opioid receptors, increases sensitivity to social rejection, while social support releases endogenous opioids that literally dull pain perception. Individual differences in rejection sensitivity, the tendency to anxiously expect and intensely react to rejection, correlate with heightened neural responses in pain processing regions. Chronic social isolation produces measurable health consequences beyond mere unhappiness. Elevated inflammation markers, compromised immune function, increased cardiovascular disease risk, and shortened lifespan. These outcomes suggest that social pain represents not metaphorical discomfort but genuine physiological distress that the body treats as a serious threat requiring homeostatic response. Fact 27. Emotional granularity and psychopathology, the cost of coarse feelings. The sophistication with which individuals differentiate their emotional experiences, termed emotional granularity or differentiation, predicts mental health outcomes with striking consistency. People demonstrating low emotional granularity tend to label diverse feeling states with broad, undifferentiated terms like bad or upset, while high granularity individuals distinguish nuanced differences between sadness, disappointment, frustration, and melancholy. This differentiation capacity involves more than linguistic preference. Neuroimaging reveals that high granularity individuals show more distinctive patterns of brain activity across different emotional states, suggesting they're actually experiencing more differentiated feelings rather than merely labeling identical experiences more precisely. Low emotional granularity predicts numerous adverse outcomes: higher rates of depression and anxiety, increased alcohol use for coping purposes, more aggressive responses to provocation, and poorer emotion regulation. The mechanism underlying these associations involves specificity in coping responses. Someone recognizing they feel guilty can address the specific transgression, while someone experiencing only undifferentiated bad feelings cannot target interventions effectively. Emotional granularity appears developable through practices enhancing emotional awareness and vocabulary acquisition. Effective labeling interventions, simply naming emotions with precision, demonstrably reduces amygdala reactivity and enhances prefrontal regulation. Cultural factors influence baseline granularity levels. Cultures with rich emotional vocabularies foster higher granularity than those with sparse emotional lexicons. Gender differences exist, with women typically demonstrating higher emotional granularity than men, likely reflecting differential socialization rather than biological sex per se. Therapeutic interventions increasingly target emotional granularity enhancement as a transdiagnostic mechanism relevant across multiple disorders. Fact 27. Emotional granularity and psychopathology, the cost of coarse feelings. The sophistication with which individuals differentiate their emotional experiences, termed emotional granularity or differentiation, predicts mental health outcomes with striking consistency. People demonstrating low emotional granularity tend to label diverse feeling states with broad, undifferentiated terms like bad or upset, while high granularity individuals distinguish nuanced differences between sadness, disappointment, frustration, and melancholy. This differentiation capacity involves more than linguistic preference. Neuroimaging reveals that high-granularity individuals show more distinctive patterns of brain activity across different emotional states, suggesting they're actually experiencing more differentiated feelings rather than merely labeling identical experiences more precisely. Low emotional granularity predicts numerous adverse outcomes: higher rates of depression and anxiety, increased alcohol use for coping purposes, more aggressive responses to provocation, and poorer emotion regulation. The mechanism underlying these associations involves specificity in coping responses. Someone recognizing they feel guilty can address the specific transgression, while someone experiencing only undifferentiated bad feelings cannot target interventions effectively. Emotional granularity appears developable through practices enhancing emotional awareness and vocabulary acquisition. Effective labeling interventions, simply naming emotions with precision, demonstrably reduces amygdala reactivity and enhances prefrontal regulation. Cultural factors influence baseline granularity levels. Cultures with rich emotional vocabularies foster higher granularity than those with sparse emotional lexicons. Gender differences exist, with women typically demonstrating higher emotional granularity than men, likely reflecting differential socialization rather than biological sex per se. Therapeutic interventions increasingly target emotional granularity enhancement as a transdiagnostic mechanism relevant across multiple disorders. Fact 29. The psychology of envy, social comparison's corrosive emotion. Envy, distinguished from jealousy through its focus on lacking what others possess rather than fearing loss of what one has, represents a particularly corrosive emotion with distinctive neural correlates and social consequences. When participants view information about superior others, neuroimaging reveals activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, a region associated with pain processing, suggesting envy literally hurts. This painful quality motivates either improvement, benign envy, or hostile schadenfreude, malicious envy, when the envied person experiences misfortune. The ventral striatum, typically activated by rewards, paradoxically activates when envied individuals suffer setbacks, revealing envy's capacity to transform others' pain into personal pleasure. Evolutionary perspectives suggest envy served adaptive functions by motivating status striving and resource acquisition in hierarchical social groups. However, modern conditions, particularly social media's curated highlight reels, create unprecedented envy triggers by facilitating constant upward social comparison. Instagram, Facebook, and similar platforms expose users to artificially inflated presentations of others' lives, generating what researchers term malignant envy through unachievable comparison standards. Individual differences in envy propensity correlate with low self-esteem, high neuroticism, and scarce resource backgrounds. Cultural factors modulate envy's expression. Collectivist cultures emphasizing harmony develop stronger norms against envy expression, while individualistic competitive cultures tacitly accept envy as natural. The distinction between admiration and envy hinges on perceived attainability. When superior others seem aspirational rather than impossibly distant, admiration rather than envy emerges. Understanding envy's psychology provides insight into consumer behavior, political populism, and the emotional toll of inequality in demonstrably stratified societies. Fact 30. Emotional contagion in digital spaces. Viral feelings across networks. The digital age has transformed emotional contagion from a local face-to-face phenomenon into a global network-mediated process with unprecedented reach and velocity. Research analyzing millions of Facebook posts demonstrated that emotional states spread through social networks independent of direct interaction or even conscious awareness. When users' news feeds were experimentally manipulated to contain more positive or negative emotional content, their own subsequent posts shifted in the corresponding emotional direction. Users exposed to positive content created more positive posts, while those seeing negative content generated more negative posts. This demonstrates emotional contagion operating through mere textual exposure without interpersonal contact. The mechanisms involve automatic mimicry and empathic resonance that operate even with digital communication stripped of the facial expressions and vocal prosody that typically carry emotional information. Emotional content enjoys algorithmic advantages in social media ecosystems. Posts eliciting high arousal emotions, whether positive excitement or negative outrage, receive preferential amplification through sharing, commenting, and algorithmic promotion. This creates what media scholars term engagement bait, where content is engineered specifically to trigger emotional responses regardless of accuracy or value. The result is emotional amplification that can cascade into collective mood disturbances, anxiety spirals, outrage cascades, and coordinated harassment campaigns. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated both beneficial and harmful aspects of digital emotional contagion. Mutual support networks provided comfort and connection, while anxiety and misinformation spread virally through the same channels. Understanding digital emotional contagion has become essential for navigating modern information ecosystems where feelings spread as readily as facts. Fact 31. The neuroscience of aesthetic emotions, beauty's neural signature. Aesthetic experiences, encounters with beauty in art, nature, music, or mathematical proofs, generate distinctive emotional states that neuroscience is beginning to decode. When viewing artworks rated as beautiful, the medial orbitofrontal cortex shows robust activation regardless of the art form, suggesting this region processes aesthetic value across modalities. Interestingly, this same region activates when experiencing moral goodness and romantic love, hinting at shared neural substrate for different forms of value. Beautiful faces, landscapes, and abstract patterns all recruit this region, though with distinct activation patterns suggesting aesthetic experience involves both universal and category-specific processing. The default mode network, typically associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thought, shows altered connectivity during profound aesthetic experiences, suggesting such moments temporarily dissolve the self-world boundary. This dissolution may account for aesthetic experiences' characteristic transportation, the feeling of being swept away or absorbed. The intensity of aesthetic response correlates with personality traits, particularly openness to experience, while also showing situational and cultural variability. Neuroplasticity occurs through repeated aesthetic engagement. Musicians' brains demonstrate enhanced connectivity between auditory and motor regions, while visual artists show structural differences in visual processing areas. These findings suggest aesthetic experiences literally reshape neural architecture through engagement. The emotional component of aesthetic experience appears crucial to its value. Pure perceptual discrimination without effective response, as occurs in certain neurological conditions, eliminates the experience's meaning. This integration of perception and feeling positions aesthetic emotions as foundational to how humans extract meaning from sensory experience. Fact 32. Emotional resilience, the neurobiology of bouncing back. Resilience, the capacity to maintain equilibrium or rapidly recover following adversity, represents a crucial emotional faculty with identifiable neural correlates and developmental trajectories. Rather than a fixed trait, resilience emerges from dynamic interactions between multiple brain systems, including threat detection circuits, reward processing networks, and cognitive control mechanisms. Resilient individuals demonstrate several characteristic neural patterns: relatively modest amygdala reactivity to stress, robust prefrontal activation enabling effective regulation, and maintained ventral striatum responsiveness to positive stimuli even under stress. Neuroplasticity research reveals resilience can be cultivated through experiences that strengthen regulatory circuits. Meditation practices demonstrably increase prefrontal cortex thickness while reducing amygdala volume. The neurochemistry of resilience involves neuropeptide Y, a molecule that appears to buffer against stress effects and shows deficiencies in PTSD. Resilience doesn't mean imperviousness to distress but rather effective mobilization of coping resources. The concept of stress inoculation suggests moderate, controllable stressors during development can enhance adult resilience by providing opportunities to practice regulatory skills. Conversely, early life adversity, particularly unpredictable or uncontrollable stress, can compromise resilience through persistent alterations in stress response systems. Attachment security in childhood predicts adult resilience, suggesting that early experiences of co-regulation, soothing by caregivers, become internalized as self-regulatory capacities. Cultural factors shape resilience expression. Collectivist cultures emphasize social support mobilization, while individualistic cultures prioritize personal agency and problem-solving. Enhancing population-level resilience has become a public health priority given mental health crisis prevalence, with interventions targeting modifiable factors like social connection, meaning-making, and emotion regulation skills. Fact 33. The emotional wisdom of tears, crying's mysterious functions. Human emotional crying, tears produced in response to psychological rather than physical irritation, represents a biological mystery unique to our species. While other animals produce tears for corneal lubrication, only humans cry from sadness, joy, frustration, or aesthetic overwhelm. The neurobiological triggers for emotional crying remain incompletely understood, though the lacrimal system receives neural input from limbic regions including the amygdala and hypothalamus. Crying's functions likely include social signaling. Tears automatically trigger empathic responses in observers, communicating distress and eliciting support, and possibly homeostatic regulation, as emotional tears contain higher concentrations of stress hormones and endorphins than reflex tears, suggesting crying may literally purge stress chemicals. People consistently report feeling better after crying, though laboratory studies produce mixed results, possibly because cathartic crying requires safe, supportive context that laboratory settings don't provide. Individual and cultural variation in crying frequency is dramatic. Women cry more frequently than men across virtually all cultures, a difference emerging at puberty and attributed to both hormonal factors and socialization. However, total prohibition against male crying is culturally specific rather than universal. Inability to cry, whether from alexithymia, certain psychiatric medications, or Sjogren's syndrome affecting tear production, often correlates with emotional difficulties, suggesting crying serves regulatory functions beyond social communication. The specific emotions triggering tears vary cross-culturally. American tears often signal sadness or frustration, while Japanese individuals more commonly cry from gratitude or awe. This variation suggests crying's meaning is partly culturally constructed despite its biological universality. Fact 34. The neuroscience of Schadenfreude, pleasure in others' misfortune. Schadenfreude, German for harm joy, names the ignoble emotion of pleasure derived from others' misfortune, a feeling most people experience but few proudly admit. Neuroscience reveals that Schadenfreude involves the reward circuitry typically activated by personal gains. When viewing disliked individuals experiencing setbacks, the ventral striatum activates proportionally to the degree of preceding envy, suggesting Schadenfreude represents reward system compensation for the pain of envying. This neural pattern illuminates Schadenfreude's social function, restoring psychological equilibrium disrupted by unfavorable social comparison. The anterior cingulate cortex, processing social pain, shows reduced activity when envied individuals suffer misfortunes, suggesting their pain literally reduces observers' discomfort. These findings paint an unflattering portrait of human social cognition, revealing that we're neurologically wired to take pleasure in rivals' suffering. Evolutionary perspectives propose Schadenfreude-motivated coalition maintenance and norm enforcement. Experiencing satisfaction when norm violators faced consequences would encourage group cohesion. However, Schadenfreude's modern manifestations often target groups rather than individuals, contributing to intergroup hostility and dehumanization. Political Schadenfreude, satisfaction at opposing parties' electoral defeats, correlates with polarization severity. Social media amplifies Schadenfreude by providing constant exposure to others' failures and public shaming, creating what critics term outrage porn, designed to trigger vindictive pleasure. Individual differences in Schadenfreude propensity correlate with higher aggression, lower empathy, and narcissistic personality traits. Cultural factors modulate Schadenfreude expression, with collectivist cultures' emphasis on harmony suppressing its open display compared to individualistic competitive cultures where Schadenfreude finds more acceptable expression through entertainment genres celebrating others' failures. Fact 35. Emotional processing during dreams, REM sleep's effective theater. Dreams, particularly those occurring during REM sleep, serve crucial emotional processing functions that neuroscience is beginning to illuminate. The sleeping brain shows paradoxical activation patterns. The limbic system, including the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex, exhibits high activity during REM sleep, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex remains relatively quiescent. This neural configuration creates a state where emotional processing occurs without the logical constraints and reality testing that characterize waking cognition, perhaps explaining dreams' often bizarre emotional logic. The threat simulation theory proposes that dreams function as virtual reality simulations for rehearsing responses to threatening situations, with emotions providing the motivational context. Consistent with this theory, negative emotions predominate in dreams, with fear, anxiety, and anger appearing more frequently than positive affects. However, the emotional regulation theory suggests dreams reprocess waking emotional experiences, extracting their meanings while reducing their effective intensity. Sleep deprivation studies support this function. Individuals deprived specifically of REM sleep show impaired emotional memory processing and increased emotional reactivity the following day. The neurotransmitter environment during REM differs markedly from waking, with decreased serotonin and norepinephrine but maintained acetylcholine, creating conditions that may facilitate emotional memory reconsolidation. PTSD characteristically disrupts this processing, with traumatic memories failing to undergo normal REM-mediated resolution, instead appearing in nightmares that replay trauma with full emotional intensity. Recent research exploring lucid dreaming, awareness during dreams, suggests conscious control within dreams might enhance therapeutic emotional processing, allowing direct confrontation of fears within the safe context of recognized dream space. Fact 36. The social baseline theory, connection as emotional default state. Traditional emotion research assumes the solitary individual as the baseline state from which to measure emotional responses. Yet social baseline theory proposes this assumption fundamentally misrepresents human neural architecture. According to this framework, the human brain evolved within continuous social contexts, optimizing for proximity to trusted others rather than isolation. Consequently, the presence of close others represents the brain's baseline state, with solitude constituting a deviation requiring neural adjustment. Neuroimaging studies support this counterintuitive proposal. When participants face threats while holding a close other's hand, threat-responsive regions including the anterior insula and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex show reduced activation compared to facing threats alone. The quality of the relationship matters. Holding a stranger's hand provides some benefit, but holding a spouse's hand, particularly in high-quality marriages, reduces threat response most dramatically. These findings suggest close relationships don't merely buffer stress reactivity but fundamentally alter how the brain represents threats. The mechanism involves distributed neural processing. The brain literally outsources some regulatory functions to trusted others, conserving metabolic resources. This social baseline explains why isolation constitutes such profound punishment and why solitary confinement produces psychological deterioration. The brain must recruit additional resources to maintain functions normally distributed across social networks. Attachment theory gains neural validation through these findings. Securely attached individuals show the strongest social baseline effects, suggesting early experiences of reliable co-regulation literally wire the brain to assume social support availability. Modern life's isolation epidemic, living alone, commuting solo, working remotely, may represent a dangerous experiment in removing the social scaffolding that human neural architecture assumes as background condition. Fact 37. Emotional regulation strategies, the cognitive toolbox for managing feelings. Humans employ diverse cognitive strategies for regulating emotional experiences, with dramatically different efficacy and costs across strategies. Cognitive reappraisal, reinterpreting situations to alter their emotional impact, represents the gold standard strategy, as it modulates emotions early in the generation process before full emotional responses develop. When participants reinterpret aversive images to reduce their negative impact, neuroimaging reveals decreased amygdala activation alongside increased dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex activity, indicating successful top-down control. Reappraisal produces superior outcomes compared to suppression, inhibiting emotional expressions after emotions have fully developed, which requires sustained prefrontal effort to override ongoing limbic activation. Suppression creates physiological paradoxes. While successfully hiding emotional expressions, it actually increases sympathetic nervous system arousal and impairs memory for events occurring during suppression. The constant monitoring required to suppress expressions depletes cognitive resources needed for other tasks. Acceptance strategies, acknowledging emotions without attempting to change them, activate different neural networks, primarily involving default mode regions and reduced regulatory effort. Mindfulness-based approaches emphasize acceptance over control, showing effectiveness particularly for anxiety and depression. Distraction, moving attention away from emotional stimuli, works effectively for acute emotion regulation but fails as a long-term strategy and may contribute to experiential avoidance patterns maintaining clinical disorders. Individual differences in habitual strategy use predict mental health outcomes. Frequent reappraisers show better psychological adjustment and social functioning, while habitual suppressors demonstrate poorer well-being and relationship quality. Cultural factors shape strategy preferences. Asian cultures emphasizing interpersonal harmony employ more suppression, while Western cultures valuing authentic expression favor reappraisal. Fact 38. The neuroscience of moral emotions, guilt, shame, and conscience. Moral emotions, guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride, constitute a fascinating category of effects that regulate social behavior through self-conscious evaluation. These emotions emerge relatively late in development, requiring sophisticated cognitive capacities including self-awareness, perspective-taking, and internalized standards. Neuroscience reveals that moral emotions recruit distinctive neural networks. Guilt, the emotion following personal standard violations, activates the anterior temporal cortex and superior temporal sulcus alongside limbic regions, areas involved in theory of mind and social cognition. This pattern suggests guilt involves modeling how one's actions affected others, consistent with its reparative behavioral motivations. Shame, by contrast, focuses on global self-evaluation rather than specific actions, recruiting medial prefrontal regions involved in self-referential processing and showing stronger links to avoidance and withdrawal. While both emotions involve the anterior cingulate cortex's conflict monitoring functions, their distinct neural signatures correspond to different behavioral and psychological consequences. Guilt motivates reparative action and behavioral modification, while shame triggers hiding and self-concealment. The distinction predicts different mental health consequences. Guilt proneness correlates with empathy and prosocial behavior, while shame proneness predicts depression, anxiety, and aggression. Cultural variation in moral emotions is dramatic. Collectivist cultures that emphasize interdependence utilize shame more prominently as a social regulator, while individualistic cultures rely more on guilt. The psychopathic personality shows profound deficits in moral emotions, with reduced amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex responses to moral transgressions, explaining psychopaths' instrumental use of immoral behaviors without corresponding emotional distress. Understanding moral emotions illuminates how evolution scaffolds social cooperation through effective systems that make norm violations internally aversive. Fact 39. Emotional expression through music, universal language of feeling. Music possesses remarkable cross-cultural capacity to convey and evoke emotions, suggesting deep evolutionary or universal structural basis for musical effect. Listeners can identify intended emotions in unfamiliar musical traditions with above-chance accuracy, recognizing sad Indian ragas, joyful African drumming patterns, or angry Western heavy metal without prior exposure. Acoustic features transcending cultural boundaries include tempo, rhythm complexity, pitch height, and spectral characteristics. Fast, rhythmically complex music in major keys with rising pitch contours reliably signals joy, while slow, rhythmically simple music in minor keys with descending contours conveys sadness. However, cultural learning substantially enhances emotional recognition, suggesting music combines universal and culturally specific elements. The neural processing of musical emotions involves extensive brain regions. The superior temporal gyrus processes acoustic features, while the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, and ventral tegmental area generate emotional responses. Music can induce genuine physiological emotions, increased heart rate, skin conductance changes, hormone releases, rather than merely representing emotions cognitively. Pleasurable music triggers dopamine release in the striatum comparable to food, sex, or drugs, explaining music's addictive potential and universal presence across human societies. Individual differences in musical emotional sensitivity correlate with empathy and emotional intelligence. The therapeutic application of these effects appears in music therapy interventions for depression, autism, and dementia. Music's emotional power likely derives from multiple mechanisms: rhythmic entrainment synchronizing listeners' physiological states, acoustic features mimicking emotional vocalizations, learned associations between particular sounds and experiences, and structural tension resolution patterns creating expectation violations that trigger emotional responses. This multifaceted capacity positions music as a powerful emotional technology. Fact 40. The physiology of emotional suppression. When hiding feelings hurts. Deliberately suppressing emotional expressions while experiencing strong internal emotions produces measurable physiological costs that accumulate with chronic use. When participants in laboratory studies watch disgusting or upsetting films while maintaining neutral expressions, they show increased sympathetic nervous system activation, elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance, compared to participants freely expressing emotions. This cardiovascular reactivity occurs despite subjective reports of successfully reducing emotional experience, creating a dissociation between subjective feelings and objective physiology. The mechanism involves continuous recruitment of dorsolateral prefrontal and anterior cingulate cortex regions to inhibit amygdala-driven expressive responses, requiring sustained metabolic expenditure. Chronic suppression correlates with numerous adverse health outcomes: hypertension, compromised immune function, increased inflammatory markers, and cardiovascular disease. The pathway from suppression to disease likely involves chronic sympathetic activation and inflammatory processes triggered by sustained stress response. Beyond physiological costs, emotional suppression impairs social functioning. Suppressing positive emotions reduces rapport development and perceived authenticity, while suppressing negative emotions during conflicts predicts relationship dissatisfaction. Memory deficits also occur. Suppressing during event encoding impairs subsequent recall, as regulatory effort consumes resources needed for memory formation. Cultural factors create differential exposure to suppression costs. Asian cultures emphasizing emotional restraint show smaller physiological reactivity during suppression, possibly reflecting culturally specific physiological tuning or because suppression feels less effortful when culturally syntonic. Individual differences in typical suppression use predict longitudinal outcomes. Habitual suppressors show declining social support networks, increased loneliness, and lower life satisfaction across years. These findings illuminate why emotional authenticity serves well-being despite occasional social costs. Fact 41. Emotional development across the lifespan, how feelings change with age. Emotional experience undergoes systematic changes across the lifespan that challenge stereotypes of emotional deterioration with aging. The socio-emotional selectivity theory proposes that shifting time horizons fundamentally alter emotional priorities. Younger people, perceiving expansive futures, prioritize information gathering and future-oriented goals, tolerating negative emotions in pursuit of knowledge and new experiences. Older adults, recognizing time's finitude, prioritize emotionally meaningful goals and experiences, cultivating positivity and avoiding unnecessary negativity. Empirical evidence supports this framework. Older adults demonstrate a positivity effect in attention and memory, preferentially processing positive over negative information, the opposite pattern from younger adults who show negativity bias. Laboratory studies find that older adults spend less time viewing negative images, remember positive images better than negative ones, and experience negative emotions less frequently despite similar positive emotion frequency. Neuroimaging reveals age-related changes in amygdala reactivity. Older adults show reduced amygdala activation to negative stimuli but maintained responses to positive stimuli. These patterns don't reflect cognitive decline, as they remain when controlling for fluid intelligence. The prefrontal cortex, despite some age-related structural decline, shows maintained or enhanced regulatory connectivity with the amygdala in older adults. Emotional complexity increases with age. Older adults more frequently experience mixed emotions simultaneously rather than the pure feeling states characteristic of youth. Emotional knowledge and vocabulary typically expand across adulthood, supporting the notion that emotional expertise develops with accumulated experience. However, age-related changes show substantial individual variation. Personality traits, health status, and social circumstances modulate trajectories. Understanding normative emotional aging can reduce pathologizing of older adults while identifying those showing problematic deviations requiring intervention. Fact 42. The neural basis of empathy, sharing others' emotional experiences. Empathy, the capacity to understand and share others' emotional experiences, relies on complex neural systems that enable humans to transcend the boundaries of individual subjectivity. When observing others' pain, disgust, or joy, overlapping neural networks activate as if experiencing those states firsthand, a phenomenon termed neural resonance. The anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex, regions processing firsthand pain and disgust, activate when merely observing others experiencing these states. This automatic resonance provides the foundation for empathic understanding, though complete empathy requires distinguishing self from other, mediated by right temporoparietal junction activity. The discovery of mirror neurons in macaques, neurons firing both when performing actions and when observing others perform them, sparked excitement about potential mechanisms for understanding others' internal states, though their role in human empathy remains debated. Individual differences in empathy correlate with structural and functional variation in relevant neural networks. Higher empathy individuals show increased gray matter density in anterior insula and adjacent frontal operculum. Empathy demonstrates interesting dissociations. Cognitive empathy, understanding others' perspectives, relies more on medial prefrontal and temporoparietal junction activity, while affective empathy, sharing their feelings, depends more on anterior insula and anterior cingulate. Psychopathy and autism both involve empathy deficits, but with opposite patterns. Psychopaths show intact cognitive empathy but impaired affective empathy, while autistic individuals often show the reverse. Gender differences emerge consistently, with women reporting and demonstrating higher empathy across most measures, though cultural socialization contributes substantially. Training studies demonstrate empathy's malleability. Compassion meditation increases empathy-related neural responses while reducing empathic distress that can lead to avoidance. Act 43. Emotional responses to nature. Biophilia's effective pull. Human emotional responses to natural environments show remarkable consistency across cultures, suggesting evolutionary origins rather than purely learned associations. The biophilia hypothesis proposes that humans possess innate tendencies to seek connections with nature and other life forms, reflecting our species' evolutionary history in natural rather than built environments. Empirical research demonstrates that exposure to natural environments, forests, beaches, parks, reliably reduces stress markers including cortisol levels, blood pressure, and heart rate variability, while simultaneously improving mood and reducing anxiety. Nature scenes activate the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with reward and default mode processing, while reducing activation in the amygdala and subgenual prefrontal cortex implicated in rumination and anxiety. Fascinatingly, even brief nature exposures, viewing nature photographs, listening to natural soundscapes, or spending just 20 minutes in parks, produce measurable benefits. The mechanisms underlying these effects remain debated. Attention restoration theory proposes that nature's gentle, non-demanding stimulation allows depleted attentional resources to recover, while stress reduction theory emphasizes nature's capacity to trigger parasympathetic activation. Specific natural features predict emotional responses with consistency. Water features strongly attract attention and generate positive effect. Prospect refuge landscapes offering both open views and sheltered areas appeal across cultures, possibly reflecting evolutionary advantage of such terrain. Fractal patterns characteristic of natural structures, coastlines, tree branching, engage visual processing in particularly pleasing ways. Modern life's nature deficit, urbanization, indoor work, screen-based leisure, may constitute an under-recognized contributor to mental health problems, as humans experience chronic deprivation of evolutionarily expected environmental inputs. Fact 44. The emotional impact of color, hue-induced effect. Colors exert measurable influences on emotional states and physiological arousal through mechanisms combining innate biological responses and culturally learned associations. Warm colors, reds, oranges, yellows, generally increase arousal, elevate heart rate and blood pressure, and prime approach behaviors, while cool colors, blues, greens, reduce arousal, lower blood pressure, and facilitate relaxation. These effects operate partly through direct physiological pathways. Wavelength differences directly influence retinal ganglion cells projecting to the suprachiasmatic nucleus regulating circadian rhythms and to emotional processing regions. However, extensive cultural learning overlays these biological substrates. Red demonstrates particularly complex emotional associations, signaling danger and triggering avoidance in some contexts while conveying excitement, passion, or dominance in others. Athletic competitions reveal performance effects. Competitors wearing red uniforms win disproportionately across combat sports, possibly because red signals dominance in primate evolutionary history. Testing contexts show red penalty effects, where seeing red before examinations impairs performance through anxiety priming. Cultural differences complicate universal claims. Western cultures associate white with purity and black with mourning, while many Asian cultures reverse these associations. Individual differences in color preferences show surprising stability across lifespan and correlate with personality dimensions. Extroverts prefer brighter, more saturated colors, while introverts favor softer, more muted hues. Marketing psychology exploits color's emotional impact extensively. Blue conveys trustworthiness in corporate branding, green signals environmental consciousness, while red and yellow stimulate appetite in restaurant design. Seasonal affective disorder treatment through light therapy demonstrates color's mood regulatory capacity, with specific wavelengths and intensities producing therapeutic effects. Understanding color's emotional impact requires appreciating both hardwired biological responses preserved across evolutionary time and flexible cultural meanings transmitted through social learning. Fact 45. The neuroscience of gratitude. Thankfulness rewires the brain. Gratitude, the positive emotion arising from recognizing benefits received from others, produces measurable neural and psychological effects that extend far beyond momentary pleasant feelings. Neuroscience research reveals that gratitude activates neural networks associated with moral cognition, value judgment, and theory of mind, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. Functional connectivity increases between these regions and reward processing structures including the ventral and dorsal striatum, suggesting gratitude integrates social cognitive processing with reward systems. Regular gratitude practice, systematically reflecting on things to be grateful for, produces lasting changes in brain structure and function. Studies implementing gratitude interventions find increased gray matter volume in posterior cingulate and medial prefrontal cortices, alongside altered resting state connectivity patterns. These neural changes correspond to psychological benefits: reduced depression and anxiety, improved sleep quality, enhanced relationship satisfaction, and increased prosocial behavior. The mechanisms likely involve multiple pathways. Gratitude redirects attention from negative rumination toward positive aspects of experience, strengthens social bonds through acknowledgement and reciprocity, provides meaning and perspective by recognizing one's dependence on others' goodwill, and may directly counteract the negativity bias that characterizes depressive cognition. Gratitude demonstrates interesting individual differences. People with higher baseline gratitude show reduced amygdala reactivity to negative stimuli and maintain striatal responses to positive stimuli, creating a neurobiological profile protective against depression. Cultural factors influence gratitude expression. Individualistic cultures emphasize gratitude toward specific others, while collectivist cultures incorporate more diffuse gratitude toward groups or abstract entities. The challenge with gratitude interventions involves maintaining practice over time as novelty effects fade, though even brief gratitude practices produce benefits lasting weeks beyond intervention completion. Fact 46. Emotional contagion through touch, the effective skin interface. Physical touch constitutes a powerful yet often overlooked channel for emotional contagion, with the capacity to transmit specific feeling states through tactile communication alone. Research demonstrates that people can decode distinct emotions, compassion, love, gratitude, anger, from brief touches on the forearm with accuracy significantly exceeding chance, even when other sensory channels are blocked. Different emotions correspond to characteristic touch patterns. Compassion elicits gentle stroking, love involves holding and caressing, anger produces sharp, forceful contact. The neurophysiological basis involves specialized C-tactile afferents, unmyelinated nerve fibers particularly responsive to gentle, stroking touch at velocities characteristic of social grooming behaviors. These afferents project to posterior insular cortex regions processing emotional touch distinct from discriminative touch pathways. Effective touch activates reward circuitry including the orbitofrontal cortex and anterior cingulate, while releasing oxytocin that facilitates bonding and trust. Interpersonal touch reduces physiological stress responses. Holding a spouse's hand during threat exposure decreases threat-related neural activation more effectively than viewing their photograph. Therapeutic touch interventions demonstrate measurable benefits for premature infants, pain patients, and elderly individuals suffering touch deprivation in institutional settings. However, touch's emotional effects are profoundly context-dependent. Identical physical contact feels radically different depending on relationship, setting, and consent. Cultural variation in touch norms creates dramatically different tactile environments. Mediterranean and Latin American cultures maintain much higher touch frequencies than Northern European or East Asian cultures. Modern life's touch deprivation, increasing single-person households, reduced physical play, pandemic-related distancing, may represent an underappreciated emotional health risk, as humans evolved in continuously tactile social environments where effective touch provided constant emotional information and regulatory support. Fact 47. The psychology of boredom, understimulation's restless distress. Boredom, long dismissed as trivial frustration, represents a distinct emotional state with specific neural correlates, evolutionary functions, and paradoxical dangers. Definitionally, boredom involves simultaneously wanting to engage in satisfying activity while finding available options inadequately engaging, a particularly uncomfortable motivational conflict. Neuroimaging reveals that boredom involves decreased activity in the default mode network alongside reduced striatal responses to potential rewards, creating a state where nothing seems appealing. This neural signature differs from depression's anhedonia, which involves blunted reward responsiveness specifically. Boredom maintains the desire for engagement but finds nothing sufficiently stimulating. The insula, processing internal bodily states, shows heightened activity during boredom, explaining its unpleasant physical sensation, the restless, uncomfortable feeling motivating escape. Evolutionary perspectives propose boredom serves as an emotional prod, motivating exploration and behavioral variation when current activities yield insufficient reward. Hunter-gatherer existence involved considerable downtime. Boredom would have motivated skill practice, social interaction, and environmental exploration. However, modern contexts create pathological boredom, chronic understimulation in repetitive work, overstimulation that raises baseline arousal making normal activities feel boring, and paradox of choice where overwhelming options induce decision paralysis. Individual differences in boredom proneness predict numerous problematic outcomes. Substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, gambling problems, aggression, and surprisingly, overeating. Boredom also correlates with meaning deficits. When life lacks purpose, even potentially engaging activities feel pointless. Cultural factors influence boredom experience. Individualistic cultures emphasizing personal fulfillment report higher boredom than collectivist cultures finding meaning in duty. Modern life's engineered stimulation, smartphone apps, social media, streaming entertainment, may paradoxically worsen boredom by training expectations for continuous novelty while eroding capacity for finding satisfaction in simple experiences. Fact 48. Emotional aspects of chronic pain, when hurt becomes feeling. Chronic pain transcends simple sensory experience, becoming deeply intertwined with emotional processing in ways that fundamentally alter both pain perception and emotional life. While acute pain serves adaptive functions, warning of tissue damage and motivating protective behavior, chronic pain persisting beyond healing time loses protective value while generating profound suffering. Neuroscience reveals that chronic pain involves reorganization of brain structure and function. Regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and anterior cingulate cortex show altered connectivity and activity patterns. These regions process not just nociceptive input but also emotional salience, fear, and suffering. Chronic pain and depression show remarkable comorbidity, with each predicting the other bidirectionally. Chronic pain increases depression risk threefold, while depression doubles chronic pain risk. Shared neural substrates partly explain this connection. Both conditions involve altered activity in anterior cingulate and prefrontal regions. The emotional dimension of pain, the suffering component distinct from pure sensation, can be dissociated through specific interventions. Mindfulness meditation reduces pain unpleasantness while leaving sensory intensity relatively unchanged, with corresponding neural changes showing decreased medial prefrontal and anterior cingulate activity. Catastrophizing, the tendency to ruminate on pain, magnify its threat value, and feel helpless, substantially amplifies pain suffering through cognitive emotional processing that increases anterior insula and dorsal anterior cingulate activity. Psychological interventions targeting catastrophizing and fear avoidance beliefs produce measurable pain relief by modifying emotional processing rather than sensory pathways. The opioid system mediates both pain and emotional reward, explaining analgesic effects of positive social experiences and why pain patients commonly develop comorbid substance use disorders. Understanding pain's emotional dimensions enables more comprehensive treatment approaches addressing suffering beyond mere nociceptive modulation. Fact 49. The emotional consequences of perfectionism, excellence's dark underbelly. Perfectionism, characterized by setting unrealistically high standards combined with harsh self-criticism following inevitable shortfalls, generates distinctive emotional patterns with serious mental health consequences. Research distinguishes between perfectionistic strivings, high personal standards and organized achievement pursuit, and perfectionistic concerns, excessive worry about mistakes and harsh self-evaluation. The latter demonstrates stronger associations with psychological distress, predicting depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and suicidal ideation. The emotional life of perfectionists involves chronic fear of failure, shame following perceived inadequacy, envy toward others' achievements, and difficulty experiencing satisfaction from accomplishments. Neural correlates include heightened activity in error monitoring systems. The anterior cingulate cortex shows enhanced responses to mistakes in perfectionistic individuals, creating constant vigilance for shortcomings. The reward system simultaneously shows blunted responses to success, as accomplishments feel merely adequate rather than celebratory. This creates a neuropsychological treadmill where effort never produces satisfaction. Perfectionism emerges from complex developmental origins involving genetic predispositions toward anxiety combined with environmental factors, parental criticism, conditional acceptance, or modeling of perfectionistic standards. Cultural factors amplify perfectionistic tendencies. Societies emphasizing competitive individualism and social comparison, particularly through social media's highlight reels, foster perfectionistic self-evaluation. Recent meta-analyses document increasing perfectionism among college students over recent decades, correlating with rising mental health problems. The emotional costs include chronic stress, difficulty initiating tasks due to fear of imperfect execution, procrastination paradoxically resulting from excessively high standards, and impaired relationships as perfectionists extend unrealistic standards to others. Treatment requires cultivating self-compassion, treating oneself with the kindness typically reserved for good friends, alongside challenging unrealistic standards and all-or-nothing thinking. Recovery involves accepting the inevitability and even value of imperfection. Fact 50. The neuroscience of hope, optimism's neural architecture. Hope, defined as the emotional state arising from realistic expectations of positive future outcomes combined with perceived agency to influence those outcomes, demonstrates distinctive neural correlates and measurable psychological benefits. Neuroimaging reveals hope activates the anterior cingulate cortex and orbitofrontal cortex, regions involved in anticipating future rewards and evaluating their probability. Hope differs from unrealistic optimism or wishful thinking by incorporating agency, the belief that one's actions can influence outcomes. This cognitive component recruits regions associated with planning and goal-directed behavior, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The neurochemistry of hope involves dopaminergic pathways. Dopamine releases in the ventral striatum correlate with anticipated rewards, providing motivational energy to pursue goals. Individual differences in dispositional hope predict numerous outcomes: better academic and athletic performance, superior physical health, faster recovery from illness, and greater life satisfaction. The mechanism involves behavioral pathways. Hopeful individuals persist longer when facing obstacles, generate alternative routes toward goals when primary paths are blocked, and maintain motivation during setbacks. Physiologically, hope correlates with healthier cardiovascular function, better immune response, and reduced inflammation markers. The relationship between hope and outcomes appears bidirectional. Hope facilitates success, while success reinforces hope, creating virtuous cycles. Conversely, hopelessness powerfully predicts depression and suicidal behavior. Interventions fostering hope demonstrate therapeutic effects. Cultural and contextual factors profoundly influence hope. Structural inequalities that objectively limit opportunities can make hope psychologically adaptive yet potentially oppressive if it individualizes responsibility for circumstances beyond personal control. The balance between maintaining hope's motivational benefits while acknowledging genuine obstacles represents a delicate psychological negotiation. Therapeutic hope cultivation involves identifying realistic goals, developing multiple pathways toward them, and building agency through experiences of effective action. Understanding hope's neuroscience illuminates how future-oriented positive emotion generates present-moment motivation and sustains effort through inevitable difficulties. Fact 51. Emotional responses to moral violations, the outrage reaction. Moral outrage, the intense anger and disgust arising from perceived ethical transgressions, involves distinctive neural processing that illuminates how humans enforce social norms through emotional means. When observing moral violations, unfairness, harm to innocence, betrayal, the amygdala and anterior insula activate strongly, generating visceral negative effect that motivates punitive action. Interestingly, the same neural regions activate whether one directly suffers injustice or merely observes third-party violations, suggesting humans possess genuine capacity for disinterested moral enforcement beyond self-interest. This altruistic punishment involves dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activation when punishing norm violators, alongside striatal reward responses when successfully sanctioning wrongdoers, suggesting moral enforcement provides intrinsic satisfaction. The emotional intensity of moral outrage serves functional purposes. It motivates costly actions to punish transgressors and deter future violations, maintaining cooperative systems that benefit group members collectively despite short-term individual costs. However, moral outrage demonstrates troubling susceptibilities to manipulation and escalation. Outrage feels righteous and justified, creating certainty that can override careful ethical reasoning. Political actors deliberately trigger outrage to mobilize supporters and dehumanize opponents. Social media architectures amplify outrage through engagement-based algorithms. Content triggering outrage receives more sharing and commenting, creating selection pressure for increasingly inflammatory content. This generates outrage cascades, where moral violations receive disproportionate attention relative to their objective severity. Neuroimaging reveals that moral outrage reduces activity in regions supporting perspective taking and complex reasoning, essentially shutting down the cognitive processes needed for ethical deliberation. The distinction between proportionate moral response and performative outrage becomes crucial. Genuine ethical responses motivate constructive action, while performative outrage serves social signaling or in-group bonding without productive outcomes. Cultural variation exists in which violations trigger outrage. Individualistic cultures particularly react to autonomy violations, while collectivist cultures respond strongly to loyalty and authority transgressions. Fact 52. The emotional effects of physical exercise. Movement regulating mood. Physical exercise produces robust mood-enhancing effects through multiple neurobiological mechanisms that neuroscience is progressively clarifying. Acute exercise triggers endorphin release, endogenous opioids that bind to receptors in the limbic system, producing the characteristic runner's high, involving euphoria and reduced pain sensitivity. However, endorphins alone inadequately explain exercise's mood effects, as naloxone, blocking opioid receptors, doesn't completely eliminate exercise-induced improvements. The endocannabinoid system also contributes. Exercise increases anandamide, an endocannabinoid producing effects similar to cannabis, including reduced anxiety and enhanced mood. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, elevated through exercise, supports neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, particularly in the hippocampus, potentially explaining exercise's antidepressant effects. Neuroimaging reveals chronic exercise increases hippocampal volume, enhances prefrontal cortex function, and normalizes amygdala reactivity patterns associated with anxiety disorders. Meta-analyses demonstrate exercise interventions produce effects comparable to antidepressant medications for mild to moderate depression, without pharmacological side effects. The mechanisms involve multiple pathways: increased monoamine neurotransmitter availability, reduced inflammation, improved sleep architecture, enhanced self-efficacy from mastery experiences, and possible distraction from rumination. Interestingly, exercise effects show dose dependence. Moderate-intensity aerobic exercise produces optimal mood benefits, while extremely high-intensity exercise can temporarily increase anxiety and stress hormones. Social aspects contribute substantially. Group exercise formats produce superior mood benefits compared to solitary exercise, suggesting social connection amplifies or mediates some effects. Individual differences in exercise response exist. Approximately 15% of individuals show minimal mood response to exercise, possibly reflecting genetic variations in relevant neurochemical systems. Modern sedentary lifestyles represent dramatic departures from evolutionary expectations. Hunter-gatherers average 10 to 15 kilometers of daily walking, possibly contributing to mental health epidemic through chronic deprivation of exercise-dependent neurobiological processes. Fact 53. The emotional architecture of addiction, when wanting exceeds liking. Addiction involves a profound distortion of emotional and motivational systems where wanting, intense craving and compulsive seeking, becomes pathologically dissociated from liking, actual pleasure derived from the substance or behavior. This dissociation reflects distinct neural systems. Liking involves opioid and endocannabinoid signaling in small hedonic hotspots within the nucleus accumbens and ventral pallidum, while wanting recruits much larger dopaminergic projections from the ventral tegmental area throughout the striatum. In addiction, dopamine systems become hypersensitized to drug-related cues while simultaneously showing blunted responses to natural rewards, creating a state where drugs feel intensely wanted despite diminishing pleasure. This neural sensitization persists long after drug cessation, explaining vulnerability to relapse decades after achieving sobriety. Stress profoundly influences addiction through corticotropin-releasing factor systems that become hyperactive, generating negative emotional states during withdrawal that drive resumed use for relief rather than pleasure, a transition from positive to negative reinforcement. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the anterior cingulate and dorsolateral regions responsible for impulse control and future-oriented decision-making, shows reduced activity and connectivity in addiction, compromising the ability to override craving despite conscious desire for abstinence. Emotional regulation deficits predict addiction vulnerability. Individuals using substances to cope with negative affect face substantially higher addiction risk than those using for social or recreational purposes. Trauma, particularly childhood adversity, powerfully predicts addiction through mechanisms involving stress system dysregulation and self-medication of emotional distress. Treatment effectiveness depends on addressing underlying emotional pathology rather than mere behavioral control. Learning adaptive emotion regulation strategies reduces relapse more effectively than willpower-based approaches. The moral framework viewing addiction as character weakness conflicts with neuroscience revealing it as a brain disorder involving hijacked motivational and emotional circuitry, though personal agency and choice remain relevant for successful recovery. Fact 54. The phenomenology of flow, optimal experiences emotional signature. Flow states, characterized by complete absorption in challenging activities that match skill level, accompanied by altered time perception and loss of self-consciousness, represent peak positive emotional experiences with distinctive neural correlates. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research identifying flow across diverse activities, rock climbing, surgery, chess, musical performance, revealed consistent subjective features. Intense concentration, merging of action and awareness, loss of reflective self-awareness, sense of control, distorted time experience, and intrinsically rewarding experience regardless of outcomes. Neuroscience investigations reveal flow involves transient hypofrontality, reduced activity in prefrontal regions supporting self-referential processing and metacognitive monitoring. This temporary deactivation explains flow's characteristic loss of self-consciousness and time distortion, as the neural systems generating these experiences go offline. Simultaneously, reward circuitry including the ventral striatum shows heightened activity, alongside task-relevant sensory and motor regions. The neurochemical profile involves elevated dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, anandamide, and serotonin, a potent cocktail producing the profound well-being characteristic of flow. The challenge-skill balance proves crucial. Tasks too difficult relative to skills produce anxiety, while tasks too easy generate boredom. Flow occurs at the boundary where challenge slightly exceeds current abilities, promoting skill development through engaged practice. Flow experiences correlate with numerous well-being indicators. Increased life satisfaction, enhanced performance, creativity enhancement, and meaning in life. However, flow remains elusive when pursued directly. It emerges as a byproduct of proper task engagement rather than an achievable goal. Modern life's fragmentation through constant interruptions and multitasking disrupts flow capacity, potentially contributing to reduced satisfaction despite increased efficiency. The deep absorption characteristic of flow may represent an evolutionarily ancient state predating modern self-consciousness, providing temporary respite from the psychological burdens of continuous self-monitoring that characterize human consciousness. Fact 55. Emotional responses to injustice. The moral anger system. Anger aroused by injustice and unfairness demonstrates unique characteristics distinguishing it from anger triggered by personal frustration or threat. This moral anger or indignation activates neural networks involving the anterior insula and dorsal striatum, regions processing norm violations and fairness evaluation. When participants observe unfair treatment in economic games, someone receiving less than their due share or being exploited, these regions activate strongly, generating visceral negative effect motivating corrective action. Remarkably, this response occurs even when the unfairness doesn't personally affect the observer, suggesting humans possess genuine concern for abstract fairness principles beyond self-interest. The ultimatum game demonstrates this dramatically. Responders frequently reject unfair offers even when rejection costs them money, preferring nothing over accepting inequitable distributions. This altruistic punishment sacrifices personal gain to sanction norm violators, maintaining social cooperation through costly enforcement. Neuroimaging during such rejections reveals activation in anterior insula reflecting disgust and in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex implementing the costly decision to punish. Individual differences in rejection rates correlate with personality dimensions. Those high in agreeableness accept unfair offers more readily, while those high in neuroticism reject more frequently. Cultural variation exists. Small-scale societies with minimal market integration show less rejection of unfair offers, while highly market-integrated societies demonstrate stronger fairness enforcement. This suggests that fairness norms partly reflect cultural learning rather than purely innate preferences. The emotional intensity of moral anger serves motivational functions, energizing confrontation of injustice despite personal costs or risks. However, moral anger's righteousness creates vulnerabilities to miscalibration, overconfidence in one's own moral perceptions, attribution errors where systemic problems are blamed on individuals, and resistance to perspective-taking that might reveal complexity. Effective justice systems must harness moral anger's motivational power while implementing procedural safeguards against its distortions. Fact 56. The neuroscience of amusement, laughter's neural and social functions. Laughter and amusement, often dismissed as frivolous, involve sophisticated neural processing and serve crucial social functions. Genuine amusement activates reward circuitry including the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area, alongside social cognition regions like the temporal parietal junction involved in perspective taking. Humor requires recognizing incongruities and understanding others' mental states. The motor act of laughter recruits brainstem regions coordinating the respiratory and vocal components of this species' universal behavior. Interestingly, laughter circuits overlap substantially with crying circuits, explaining why intense emotions sometimes produce ambiguous expressions and why people sometimes laugh when nervous or distressed. Laughter serves multiple functions beyond humor response. It signals play and non-aggression, coordinates social bonding through synchronized physiological states, and provides a social grooming mechanism that enables humans to bond in larger groups than manual grooming could support. The contagious nature of laughter, difficulty suppressing when others laugh, reflects neural mirroring mechanisms that synchronize group members' emotional states. Laughter releases endorphins that elevate pain thresholds. Studies demonstrate that participants who've recently laughed tolerate more physical discomfort, suggesting laughter may have analgesic properties. Humor appreciation demonstrates sophisticated cognitive components, detecting incongruity, resolving it through reinterpretation, experiencing positive emotional response, that recruit distributed neural networks. Individual differences in humor styles correlate with personality and mental health. Affiliative humor that bonds people together associates with higher well-being, while aggressive or self-defeating humor predicts poorer adjustment. Laughter yoga and therapeutic humor interventions demonstrate measurable health benefits including reduced stress hormones, improved immune function and enhanced mood. The distinctly human capacity for abstract humor, puns, irony, satire, reflects our unique cognitive abilities while serving the ancient mammalian function of play signaling and social cohesion. Fact 56. The neuroscience of amusement, laughter's neural and social functions. Laughter and amusement, often dismissed as frivolous, involve sophisticated neural processing and serve crucial social functions. Genuine amusement activates reward circuitry including the nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area, alongside social cognition regions like the temporal parietal junction involved in perspective taking. Humor requires recognizing incongruities and understanding others' mental states. The motor act of laughter recruits brainstem regions coordinating the respiratory and vocal components of this species' universal behavior. Interestingly, laughter circuits overlap substantially with crying circuits, explaining why intense emotions sometimes produce ambiguous expressions and why people sometimes laugh when nervous or distressed. Laughter serves multiple functions beyond humor response. It signals play and non-aggression, coordinates social bonding through synchronized physiological states, and provides a social grooming mechanism that enables humans to bond in larger groups than manual grooming could support. The contagious nature of laughter, difficulty suppressing when others laugh, reflects neural mirroring mechanisms that synchronize group members' emotional states. Laughter releases endorphins that elevate pain thresholds. Studies demonstrate that participants who've recently laughed tolerate more physical discomfort, suggesting laughter may have analgesic properties. Humor appreciation demonstrates sophisticated cognitive components, detecting incongruity, resolving it through reinterpretation, experiencing positive emotional response, that recruit distributed neural networks. Individual differences in humor styles correlate with personality and mental health. Affiliative humor that bonds people together associates with higher well-being, while aggressive or self-defeating humor predicts poorer adjustment. Laughter yoga and therapeutic humor interventions demonstrate measurable health benefits including reduced stress hormones, improved immune function and enhanced mood. The distinctly human capacity for abstract humor, puns, irony, satire, reflects our unique cognitive abilities while serving the ancient mammalian function of play signaling and social cohesion. Fact 58. The emotional dimension of decision-making, how feelings guide choices. Contrary to traditional economic models portraying emotions as decision-making contaminants that rational agents should suppress, modern neuroscience reveals emotions as essential information sources enabling effective choice under uncertainty. The somatic marker hypothesis proposes that emotional responses to options, experienced as gut feelings, intuitions, or bodily sensations, represent rapid summaries of past outcomes associated with similar choices, guiding behavior before exhaustive analysis completes. When facing complex decisions with uncertain outcomes, purely rational calculation proves computationally intractable. Emotional heuristics provide shortcuts enabling timely action. Patients with ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage, disrupting emotion cognition integration, demonstrate this principle through their catastrophically poor real-world decisions despite preserved intellectual function. In Iowa gambling task experiments, these patients fail to develop the anticipatory anxiety responses that guide healthy participants toward advantageous choices, instead persistently selecting from disadvantageous decks. Emotions serve multiple decision functions. Anticipated emotions influence choice through imagining future feeling states. Incidental emotions, current moods unrelated to the decision, biased choice systematically, and integral emotions, feelings about the decision itself, provide evaluative information. Fear and anxiety promote risk aversion and cautious, detailed processing, while happiness encourages risk-taking and reliance on heuristics. Anger paradoxically increases risk-seeking despite being a negative emotion, illustrating that valence alone inadequately predicts decision effects. Effective decisions require emotional input balanced with cognitive analysis. Pure emotionality produces impulsive choice, while emotional suppression eliminates crucial information. Individual differences in emotional awareness correlate with decision quality. Alexithymic individuals who struggle to identify emotions show poorer judgment in domains requiring effective input. Understanding emotions' role in decision-making enables designing choice architectures that work with rather than against human emotional psychology. Fact 59. The neuroscience of loneliness, social isolation's neural anguish. Loneliness, the painful emotional state arising from perceived social isolation, involves distinctive neural signatures and demonstrates profound impacts on physical and mental health rivaling traditional risk factors like smoking or obesity. Neuroimaging reveals that social exclusion activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, regions processing physical pain, suggesting social and physical pain share neural substrates reflecting humans' fundamental need for social connection. Lonely individuals demonstrate hypervigilance to social threats, showing increased amygdala reactivity to negative social stimuli while simultaneously showing reduced activity in reward regions when viewing positive social scenes. This pattern creates a self-perpetuating cycle. Loneliness generates suspicious, threat-focused social perception that undermines new relationship formation, perpetuating isolation. The ventral striatum shows blunted responses to social rewards in lonely individuals, suggesting anhedonia specifically for social pleasure. Chronically lonely individuals show altered hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis functioning, with elevated inflammation markers, compromised immune responses, and disrupted sleep, biological effects that accumulate into serious health consequences. Loneliness predicts premature mortality as strongly as smoking 15 cigarettes daily, operates through both behavioral pathways, isolation reducing health behaviors, and direct physiological effects on cardiovascular, immune, and neuroendocrine systems. The subjective perception of isolation matters more than objective social contact frequency. Individuals can feel profoundly lonely despite numerous shallow connections while others feel satisfied with few deep relationships. Evolutionary perspectives propose that social pain motivated reconnection efforts, making isolation psychologically intolerable so individuals would rejoin groups necessary for survival. However, modern environments create pathological loneliness through urbanization's anonymity, geographic mobility fragmenting communities, digital communication substituting for physical presence, and work demands limiting relationship investment. Interventions addressing loneliness must target the distorted social cognition and hypervigilance rather than merely increasing social contact, as quantity without quality fails to resolve subjective isolation. Fact 60. Emotional expression across cultures, universal and variable aspects. The debate concerning emotional expression's universality versus cultural specificity has occupied emotion researchers for decades, with contemporary evidence supporting a nuanced middle position. Paul Ekman's pioneering research demonstrated that isolated New Guinea populations accurately identified facial expressions of happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise in Westerners, suggesting biological universality for these basic emotions. This finding sparked widespread acceptance of universal emotion theory, proposing that all humans share innate emotional expressions evolved through natural selection. However, subsequent research complicates this picture considerably. While some expressions show cross-cultural recognition above chance levels, accuracy rates vary substantially, and many emotion concepts lack corresponding facial configurations. The dialect theory proposes that emotional expression combines universal components with culture-specific inflections analogous to language dialects. Cultural display rules profoundly modify expression. Japanese participants show minimal facial expressiveness compared to Americans when authority figures observe, despite similar expressions when alone. Many emotion concepts prove culturally specific without clear Western equivalents. Japanese ame, German schadenfreude, Portuguese saudade, raising questions about emotional experience universality. Constructionist perspectives propose that emotions aren't biologically fixed categories but rather context-dependent patterns constructed through cultural learning and conceptual knowledge. This framework emphasizes cultural variation while acknowledging that all humans work with similar biological components, nervous system, cardiovascular system, hormonal systems, that limit possible emotional configurations. Individual cultures develop particular emotional repertoires emphasizing certain patterns while downplaying others, creating genuine diversity in emotional life. The implications extend beyond academic interest to practical domains like emotion recognition algorithms, mental health assessment across cultures, and understanding intercultural misunderstandings. The emerging consensus recognizes both universal biological constraints and substantial cultural shaping, avoiding simplistic either-or formulations in favor of acknowledging emotions' complex biosocial nature. Fact 61. The emotional impact of rhythmic synchronization, moving together, feeling together. Rhythmic synchronization with others, marching in unison, dancing together, singing chorally, produces powerful emotional effects including increased social bonding, elevated mood, and reduced sense of self-other boundaries. This phenomenon, termed collective effervescence by sociologist Emil Durkheim, has neurobiological foundations that evolution likely exploited for group cohesion. When individuals synchronize their movements, mirror neuron systems activate in ways that blur self-other representations, creating what researchers term interpersonal entrainment. This neural blurring correlates with increased cooperation, trust, and affiliation towards synchronized partners. Endorphin release during synchronized movement creates shared pleasure that bonds participants, while oxytocin elevation enhances social connection. Studies demonstrate that after synchronizing movements, people report feeling more similar to partners, cooperate more in economic games, and show enhanced prosocial behavior. Interestingly, synchronization effects operate largely unconsciously. People need not intend bonding for these effects to occur, explaining why military drills, religious rituals, and protest marches universally employ synchronized movement to forge group solidarity. The emotional power of collective music making, from stadium concerts to religious worship, derives partly from this synchronization effect. Thousands of voices joining in song create not just acoustic phenomena but shared neural states through respiratory, vocal, and attentional synchronization. Mother-infant interactions feature extensive temporal coordination. Gaze, vocalization, and touch rhythms synchronize, creating early bonding through shared rhythmic states. Modern life's increasing isolation from shared rhythmic activities, the decline of communal singing, dancing, and ritualistic gatherings, may contribute to weakening social fabric by reducing opportunities for synchronization-based bonding. The neurobiological machinery underlying these effects evolved in ancestral environments where survival depended on coordinated group action, making rhythm and synchronization powerful emotional technologies for generating collective identity and cooperation. Fact 62. The emotional consequences of cognitive dissonance, when beliefs and behaviors clash. Cognitive dissonance, the psychologically uncomfortable state arising when holding contradictory beliefs or when behavior contradicts attitudes, generates genuine emotional distress that individuals are motivated to resolve through various strategies. Leon Festinger's classic research demonstrated that participants who performed boring tasks but told others the tasks were interesting came to actually believe the tasks were more enjoyable than participants paid more to lie, a counterintuitive finding explained by dissonance reduction. The smaller payment created dissonance, why would I lie for so little? Resolved by adjusting attitudes to align with behavior. Neuroscience reveals that cognitive dissonance activates the anterior cingulate cortex, a region detecting conflicts and errors, alongside the insula, processing negative affect. This neural signature reflects genuine psychological distress rather than mere logical inconsistency. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex subsequently activates as individuals engage cognitive work to reduce dissonance through rationalization, attitude change, or selective attention. People employ numerous strategies for managing dissonance. modifying attitudes to match behavior, changing behavior to match attitudes, adding consonant cognitions that outweigh dissonant ones, or trivializing the inconsistency's importance. The motivation to reduce dissonance powerfully shapes belief systems. After making difficult choices, people enhance chosen options' attractiveness while denigrating rejected alternatives, creating post-decision attitude shifts that weren't present before commitment. This explains escalation of commitment phenomena, continuing investments in failing courses of action because abandoning them would create dissonance with past decisions. Cultural differences exist in dissonance susceptibility. Individualistic cultures emphasizing personal consistency show stronger effects than collectivist cultures where situational flexibility receives greater value. Understanding cognitive dissonance illuminates why people maintain logically inconsistent belief systems. Smokers knowing cigarettes cause cancer while continuing to smoke, environmental activists driving gas-guzzling vehicles. As the emotional discomfort generated by inconsistency motivates psychological gymnastics that preserve self-concept integrity rather than behavioral change that would eliminate the inconsistency. Fact 63. The emotional effects of hormonal fluctuations, endocrine modulation of mood. Hormonal fluctuations across menstrual cycles, pregnancy, postpartum periods, and life transitions profoundly influence emotional experience through direct effects on brain chemistry and neural activity. Estrogen and progesterone, cycling across the menstrual phase, modulate serotonin, GABA, and dopamine systems, creating predictable mood variations for many individuals. The luteal phase, characterized by declining progesterone, correlates with increased negative affect and anxiety in vulnerable individuals, manifesting as premenstrual dysphoric disorder in severe cases. Neuroimaging reveals that estrogen enhances amygdala reactivity to emotional stimuli, while progesterone metabolites have anxiolytic effects through GABA modulation. Hormonal contraceptives alter these natural patterns, with synthetic hormones producing different emotional effects than endogenous fluctuations. Some individuals experience mood improvements while others develop depression on hormonal contraception, likely reflecting individual variation in neural sensitivity. Pregnancy involves dramatic hormonal shifts. Progesterone levels increase 50-fold while estrogen rises 30-fold. That broadly affect emotional processing, generally promoting behavioral changes adaptive for caregiving. Postpartum hormone crashes contribute to the high incidence of mood disturbance in the weeks following birth. Approximately 80% experience transient baby blues, while 15% develop clinical postpartum depression involving more severe and persistent symptoms. Testosterone also influences emotion, with higher levels generally associated with increased dominance-seeking, competitiveness, and reduced fear, though effects depend heavily on social context. Hormone replacement during gender-affirming therapy produces meaningful emotional shifts. Transgender women report increased emotional lability and crying, while transgender men describe intensified anger and sexuality. Understanding hormonal influences on emotion doesn't reduce feelings to mere chemistry, but rather illuminates one crucial mechanism among many shaping emotional life, with implications for personalizing mental health treatment and destigmatizing hormonally influenced mood changes as biological rather than characterological. Fact 64. The psychology of anticipatory emotion, future-oriented feeling states. Humans possess remarkable capacity for experiencing emotions about anticipated future events, dreading upcoming presentations, eagerly anticipating vacations, worrying about potential outcomes, with these anticipatory emotions powerfully influencing present behavior and subjective well-being. Anticipated emotions recruit similar neural circuitry as currently experienced emotions. Imagining future threats activates the amygdala despite no present danger, while anticipating rewards activates the ventral striatum. This capacity enables planning and foresight but also creates vulnerabilities to anxiety and unnecessary suffering. The hedonic forecasting literature reveals systematic errors in predicting future emotional states. People overestimate the intensity and duration of both positive and negative future emotions, failing to account for adaptation and coping. This impact bias leads to suboptimal decisions, overvaluing outcomes that will bring less satisfaction than predicted. Anticipated regret, imagining the disappointment following poor choices, influences decision-making powerfully, sometimes beneficially by encouraging deliberation but sometimes problematically by triggering choice paralysis. The mere anticipation of pleasant events contributes significantly to overall happiness. Research suggests anticipation provides more consistent well-being benefits than consumption itself, which often disappoints relative to expectations. Savoring practices that deliberately extend anticipatory pleasure, planning trips in detail, imagining upcoming pleasant events, leverage this effect. Conversely, chronic negative anticipation characteristic of anxiety disorders creates sustained suffering about largely imaginary futures, with neural activity patterns indistinguishable from processing actual threats. The prefrontal cortex's capacity for mental time travel, simulating possible futures, represents an evolutionary advancement enabling sophisticated planning but simultaneously creates the uniquely human capacity for suffering about events that never occur. Therapeutic interventions increasingly target anticipatory processes, challenging catastrophic predictions, reality testing worried expectations, and cultivating present-moment awareness to reduce unnecessary anticipatory distress while maintaining functional planning. Fact 65. Emotional aspects of creativity, mood states and innovative thinking. Mood states exert powerful influences on creative thinking through effects on cognitive processing styles, with different emotional states facilitating different forms of creativity. Positive mood promotes expansive, associative thinking that enhances conceptual combination and divergent idea generation. The neurochemistry involves dopamine, which modulates prefrontal striatal circuits supporting cognitive flexibility. Elevated dopamine during positive mood states increases switching between mental sets and remote association formation. Studies consistently show that induced positive effect increases performance on divergent thinking tasks requiring generation of numerous novel solutions. However, the mood-creativity relationship demonstrates important nuances. Mild positive mood enhances creativity more than intense euphoria, which can impair focused work through distraction. Negative moods, particularly dysphoria, promote more systematic, detail-oriented processing that benefits analytical problem-solving and critical evaluation of ideas. Some evidence suggests that cycling between positive and negative states, approaching problems with positive moods generativity then critically evaluating with negative moods analytical style, produces optimal creative output. Anxiety and depression generally impair creativity, though some research documents enhanced creativity in individuals with mood disorders during euthymic periods, possibly reflecting compensatory cognitive strategies developed during symptomatic periods. The romantic notion of the tortured artist producing best work while suffering appears largely mythical. Severe psychopathology overwhelmingly impairs creative productivity despite occasional exceptions. The relationship between mania and creativity proves complex. Hypomanic states featuring elevated energy without psychotic symptoms sometimes enhance creative productivity through increased confidence, reduced need for sleep and rapid idea generation, but full manic episodes disorganization disrupts coherent creative work. Environmental factors moderating mood creativity relationships include time pressure, evaluation apprehension, and perceived autonomy. Understanding these relationships enables deliberately cultivating mood states appropriate for different creative phases. Positive effect for brainstorming, mild negative effect for editing. Fact 66. The neuroscience of vicarious emotions. Feeling through others' experiences. Humans routinely experience genuine emotions triggered by others' experiences rather than personal circumstances. Crying during sad films, celebrating strangers' achievements, feeling anxious while watching someone face danger. A capacity termed vicarious emotion, with fascinating neural underpinnings. These responses involve neural simulation of observed states. When watching someone in pain, pain processing regions including the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex activate, though typically less intensely than during first-hand pain. This activation generates authentic emotional experience, physiological arousal, subjective feeling, motivational effects, indistinguishable from directly triggered emotions. Mirror neuron systems likely contribute by automatically simulating observed actions and states, though their precise role remains debated. Individual differences in vicarious emotional intensity correlate with empathy measures and show interesting variation. Fiction readers demonstrate stronger vicarious responses than non-readers, suggesting narrative engagement cultivates emotional simulation capacity. Evolutionary perspectives propose vicarious emotions facilitated social learning and cooperation. Understanding conspecific states enabled predicting behavior and coordinating action. The capacity for vicarious emotion creates both benefits and vulnerabilities. It enables profound aesthetic experiences through narrative art while also exposing individuals to secondary trauma through sustained exposure to others' suffering. Healthcare workers, therapists, and journalists face occupational risks from chronic vicarious trauma absorption. Importantly, vicarious emotions demonstrate selectivity. People experience stronger responses to in-group members, attractive individuals, and those perceived as similar, revealing how social categories modulate emotional resonance. This selectivity has troubling implications for moral consideration. Distant or outgroup suffering fails to generate proportionate emotional response despite equivalent objective severity. Media representations powerfully shape vicarious emotions by determining which suffering becomes visible and which remains abstract, with resulting emotional responses driving variable humanitarian concern. Understanding vicarious emotions illuminates how humans transcend individual experience while revealing limitations in our capacity for universal empathic concern. Fact 67. The emotional consequences of unemployment, identity loss and affective deterioration. Unemployment produces profound emotional consequences extending far beyond financial hardship, involving threats to identity, purpose, and social connection. Meta-analyses demonstrate unemployment consistently predicts elevated depression, anxiety, and diminished life satisfaction, even controlling for income loss, suggesting psychological mechanisms beyond material deprivation. Jahoda's latent deprivation theory proposes that employment provides not just manifest benefits, income, but crucial latent benefits: temporal structure organizing the day, shared experiences and social contact outside family, collective purpose and identity, regular activity and involvement, and social status. Unemployment's removal of these psychological supports generates emotional deterioration through multiple pathways. The emotional trajectory shows predictable phases: initial shock and denial, optimism during early job search, growing pessimism and distress as search extends, and eventual resignation and adapted depression in long-term unemployment. However, substantial individual variation exists based on financial reserves, social support, attribution patterns, and alternative identity sources. Neurobiological changes accompany long-term unemployment. Chronic stress elevates cortisol initially, followed by eventual flattening showing dysregulation. Inflammatory markers increase, and neural reward sensitivity diminishes, creating anhedonia that paradoxically reduces job search motivation. The stigma surrounding unemployment amplifies emotional costs beyond objective circumstances. Shame and reduced self-worth arise from internalized narratives about merit and productivity. Cultural variation exists in unemployment's emotional toll. Societies with stronger social safety nets and less individualistic attribution for unemployment show attenuated psychological effects. Retirement demonstrates that leaving work need not produce comparable distress, suggesting employment's psychological importance involves not just structure and activity but specifically meaningful, valued activity. Unemployment's emotional consequences highlight work's role as source of identity, meaning, and social connection beyond mere income generation, with implications for technological unemployment concerns as automation advances. Fact 68. The emotional effects of parenthood, joy, exhaustion, and identity transformation. Parenthood initiates profound emotional transformations involving simultaneously the most intense positive and negative effects most people experience, alongside fundamental shifts in identity, priorities, and neural function. Contrary to simplistic narratives, research documents that parents report lower life satisfaction, marital satisfaction, and day-to-day happiness compared to non-parents, particularly during children's early years, the parenthood paradox. This paradox arises because while discrete moments with children generate intense joy and meaning, the aggregate experience involves sleep deprivation, financial strain, relationship tension, and identity disruption. However, parents simultaneously report greater life meaning and purpose, suggesting that well-being encompasses dimensions beyond hedonic pleasure. The neurobiological changes accompanying parenthood are dramatic, particularly in mothers. Gray matter volume changes occur in regions supporting empathy, threat detection, and reward processing. Oxytocin and prolactin systems are permanently altered, enhancing bonding capacity while potentially increasing anxiety about infant welfare. Fathers show similar but less pronounced neural remodeling. The emotional bond with offspring engages reward circuitry with intensity rivaling or exceeding other natural rewards. Infant cues activate dopaminergic pathways producing powerful motivation to provide care despite enormous costs. This emotional architecture evolved because offspring survival constituted the ultimate reproductive success. Natural selection crafted emotions ensuring parental investment despite sacrifice. Postpartum mood disturbances affect substantial minorities, 15% developing clinical depression, even more experiencing anxiety disorders, reflecting vulnerability periods as hormones shift and sleep deprivation accumulates. The emotional experience of parenthood varies substantially across individuals and contexts. Social support, financial security, parenting stress, and individual temperament all modulate outcomes. Cultural narratives strongly shape expectations and interpretations. Societies romanticizing parenthood while providing inadequate support create conditions where struggling parents experience both distress and shame about that distress, compounding difficulties. Understanding parenthood's emotional complexity enables more realistic expectations and reduced stigma around acknowledging challenges alongside rewards. Fact 69. The emotional dimension of nostalgia, longing's adaptive functions. Nostalgia, that bittersweet longing for past times, serves surprising psychological functions despite its melancholic emotional tone. Once considered a psychiatric disorder or symptom of homesickness, contemporary research reveals nostalgia as a sophisticated emotional regulation mechanism providing multiple benefits. Experimentally induced nostalgia through music, photographs, or autobiographical memory prompts increases feelings of social connectedness, enhances meaning in life, boosts self-esteem, and generates optimism about the future, seemingly paradoxical given that nostalgia focuses on irrecoverable past. The mechanisms involve accessing memories of times when life felt meaningful and relationships felt secure, providing psychological resources during present difficulties. Nostalgia functions as a repository of positive self-concept. Remembering when one was loved, competent, or happy bolsters current self-esteem. The social dimension proves particularly important. Nostalgic memories typically feature significant relationships, and recalling past connections reduces current loneliness. Neuroscience reveals nostalgia activates reward regions including the ventral striatum alongside regions supporting autobiographical memory and emotion regulation, suggesting it provides genuine hedonic pleasure while simultaneously engaging deliberate mood management. The characteristic bittersweetness, simultaneously pleasurable and sad, arises from juxtaposing past happiness with awareness of its loss and temporal distance. Individual differences exist in nostalgia proneness. Higher trait nostalgia correlates with greater social connectedness and meaning in life, suggesting frequent nostalgics successfully employ this regulatory strategy. However, excessive nostalgia can become maladaptive if it prevents present engagement or fixates on idealized pasts that prevent accepting current reality. Cultural and historical factors shape nostalgic content. Collective nostalgia for shared historical periods, things were better back then, can either foster social cohesion through shared memory or promote problematic resistance to social progress. Marketing extensively exploits nostalgia, using retro aesthetics and throwback products to trigger positive associations and purchase behavior. Understanding nostalgia's functions illuminates how humans use temporally extended self-concept, the ability to remember past selves and imagine future selves, for present emotional regulation. Fact 70. The neuroscience of emotional tears, crying's chemical communication. Emotional tears represent a uniquely human phenomenon whose biological functions remain partially mysterious despite extensive study. Unlike reflex tears serving lubrication and protection, emotional tears arise from psychological states, sadness, joy, frustration, aesthetic overwhelm, through neural pathways connecting limbic emotional centers to the lacrimal system via the parasympathetic nervous system. The chemical composition of emotional tears differs systematically from reflex tears, containing higher concentrations of stress hormones, ACTH, prolactin, leucine, enkephalin, and endorphins. This finding sparked the biochemical hypothesis, proposing that crying literally purges stress chemicals from the body, providing physiological relief. However, given tear volume, the quantitative significance of this elimination remains uncertain. More clearly established is crying's social signaling function. Tears automatically trigger empathic responses in observers, communicating distress and soliciting support more effectively than verbal expression alone. The visibility of tears evolved specifically for social communication. Only humans produce emotional tears in quantities sufficient to roll down cheeks rather than merely moistening eyes. Infants crying represents their primary mechanism for eliciting caregiving, with specific cryoacoustic features reliably triggering adult nurturing responses. The inability to cry, whether from Sjogren's syndrome, certain medications, or psychological alexithymia, often correlates with difficulty processing emotions and lower well-being. Individual and cultural variation in crying frequency is substantial. Women cry approximately 4 times more frequently than men across virtually all cultures, differences emerging at puberty and attributed to both hormonal factors, testosterone inhibits crying, and socialization. Cultural display rules regulate crying's acceptability. Some cultures encourage emotional expression through tears while others stigmatize it. The specific emotions triggering tears vary cross-culturally, suggesting crying's meaning is partly culturally constructed. Therapeutic crying appears to require safe, supportive contexts. Forced or humiliating crying doesn't produce the cathartic relief that voluntary, supported crying can provide. Fact 71. Emotional responses to injustice directed at others. The psychology of empathic anger. Anger arising from witnessing injustice toward others, empathic or vicarious anger, demonstrates humans' capacity for emotional responses transcending narrow self-interest. When observing third-party unfairness, the anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex activate in patterns similar to experiencing personal injustice, generating genuine anger that motivates costly intervention. This response evolved to support indirect reciprocity and reputation-based cooperation. Populations containing individuals willing to punish norm violators benefit collectively despite short-term individual costs to punishers. Empathic anger drives altruistic punishment, sacrificing personal resources to sanction wrongdoers who haven't personally harmed the punisher. Economic game studies demonstrate people pay to punish unfair players even in anonymous one-shot interactions without reputation consequences, suggesting genuine moral motivation beyond strategic cooperation. Neuroimaging during altruistic punishment reveals dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity implementing costly sanctioning decisions, alongside ventral striatum activation suggesting intrinsic satisfaction from norm enforcement. The intensity of empathic anger depends on multiple factors: victim-observer relationship proximity, perceived victim vulnerability, transgression severity, and attribution of perpetrator intentionality. Empathic anger directed at systems rather than individuals can motivate social activism and reform efforts, though sustaining such anger without burnout challenges activists. The selectivity of empathic anger creates moral complications. People experience stronger responses to in-group members suffering, attractive victims, and proximate rather than distant injustices, creating unequal moral concern despite equivalent objective severity. Media coverage powerfully influences empathic anger by determining which injustices receive visibility. Systematic attention to some suffering while ignoring comparable or worse suffering elsewhere shapes collective moral priorities. Social media amplifies empathic anger through viral exposure to injustice, sometimes productively mobilizing reform but sometimes generating performative outrage more focused on signaling than substantive change. Understanding empathic anger's psychology illuminates both humanity's genuine moral capacities and the various factors that channel those capacities toward selective targets. Fact 72. The emotional consequences of chronic stress, when temporary adaptation becomes pathology. Chronic stress transforms adaptive short-term physiological and emotional responses into pathological states through sustained activation of systems designed for temporary mobilization. The acute stress response, rapid sympathetic nervous system activation and HPA axis stimulation, adaptively redirects resources toward immediate survival at the expense of functions important only long-term, like growth, reproduction, immune function, and memory consolidation. When stress becomes chronic, these temporary redistributions create cumulative damage. Persistently elevated cortisol produces hippocampal atrophy, particularly in regions crucial for memory and emotion regulation, through mechanisms involving reduced neurogenesis and dendritic branching. The amygdala, conversely, shows increased volume and hyperreactivity, creating heightened threat sensitivity. Prefrontal cortex function deteriorates, compromising emotion regulation, decision-making, and impulse control. These neural changes generate characteristic emotional consequences: chronic anxiety, irritability, anhedonia, helplessness, and eventually clinical depression. The subjective experience involves feeling constantly on edge, unable to relax, with even minor stressors triggering disproportionate emotional responses as regulatory capacity depletes. Sleep disturbances compound difficulties, as stress hormones interfere with sleep while sleep deprivation further impairs stress response systems. Chronic stress produces systemic physiological effects beyond the brain: cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, accelerated aging, immunosuppression, through persistent inflammation and sympathetic dominance. Individual differences in stress vulnerability reflect genetics, early life experiences, and current circumstances. Childhood adversity particularly predicts adult stress sensitivity through permanent alterations in stress response calibration. Social support powerfully buffers stress effects, both through practical assistance and through biological pathways including oxytocin release and vagal tone enhancement. Modern life creates unprecedented chronic stressors: financial insecurity, social comparison through media, information overload, environmental degradation, that human Stone Age stress systems handle poorly, as they evolved for acute physical threats rather than sustained psychological pressures. Addressing chronic stress requires both individual strategies and social structural changes, reducing stressor exposure and enhancing recovery opportunities. Fact 73. Emotional expression through art, aesthetic creation as emotional processing. Art creation serves sophisticated emotional functions beyond mere expression, involving complex processing that can transform, clarify, and integrate difficult feelings. The act of externalizing internal states through creative media, visual art, music, writing, dance, engages neural networks spanning emotional processing regions, motor systems, and reward circuitry. Creating art activates the default mode network involved in self-referential processing, suggesting artistic creation involves deep self-exploration. Simultaneously, focused engagement with creative materials induces flow states that temporarily suspend rumination and self-criticism. The artistic process provides emotional distance from overwhelming experiences by transforming them into external objects that can be examined, manipulated, and ultimately mastered symbolically. Trauma-focused art therapy exploits this mechanism. Creating visual representations of traumatic experiences allows processing without requiring verbal articulation, which many trauma survivors find impossible or re-traumatizing. The sensory engagement involved in artistic creation, handling clay, mixing colors, producing sounds, provides grounding and present-moment focus that interrupts anxiety and rumination. Neuroimaging reveals that viewing self-created art activates reward regions more intensely than viewing others' comparable work, suggesting personal meaning amplifies aesthetic response. The deliberate crafting of aesthetic form imposes structure on chaotic emotional experience, providing sense of control and mastery. Different artistic media afford different emotional functions. Visual arts enable spatial representation of internal states, music channels emotional intensity through temporal patterns, creative writing facilitates narrative integration of fragmented experiences, and movement-based arts reconnect mind and body. Individual differences exist in artistic creation's emotional benefits. Those higher in openness to experience show stronger effects, while perfectionists may find creative activities generate performance anxiety rather than emotional release. The evaluation climate dramatically influences outcomes. Non-judgmental creative contexts facilitate emotional processing, while critical evaluation can inhibit expression. Understanding art-making's emotional functions illuminates why virtually all human cultures engage in aesthetic creation and why eliminating arts education may harm student well-being beyond merely reducing cultural enrichment. Fact 74. The emotional effects of social comparison, keeping score and paying costs. Social comparison, evaluating oneself relative to others, constitutes a fundamental human cognitive process with profound emotional consequences. Festinger's social comparison theory proposed that people possess drives to evaluate their abilities and opinions, relying on social comparison when objective standards are unavailable. However, comparison generates systematic emotional effects beyond mere information gathering. Upward comparison, contrasting oneself with superior others, typically produces negative affect, envy, and reduced self-esteem, though can occasionally inspire improvement efforts. Downward comparison, contrasting with inferior others, generally enhances mood and self-evaluation, though can produce guilt or fear of similar decline. The emotional effects depend critically on perceived attainability. If superior others seem achievably similar, upward comparison inspires, but if the gap appears unbridgeable, it demoralizes. The medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex activate during self-evaluation, including comparative judgments, suggesting social comparison recruits self-referential processing. Individual differences in comparison orientation predict emotional outcomes. High comparison frequency correlates with lower well-being, higher neuroticism, and increased depression and anxiety. Modern environments amplify comparison opportunities and intensify their emotional effects. Social media platforms provide constant exposure to carefully curated presentations of others' lives, creating unattainably high comparison standards. Instagram and Facebook usage correlates with depression and anxiety, particularly among adolescents, through mechanisms involving social comparison. The visibility of consumption patterns in wealthy societies makes economic comparisons inescapable. Relative income predicts life satisfaction more strongly than absolute income in developed nations, demonstrating comparison's power. Cultural differences exist. Collectivist cultures emphasizing group harmony attempt to minimize comparative evaluation, while individualistic competitive cultures encourage continuous benchmarking against others. Economic inequality amplifies comparison's toxicity by expanding the visible range of wealth and status, making relative deprivation more salient. Strategies for managing comparison include limiting exposure to upward comparisons through media restriction, cultivating gratitude practices, redirecting attention toward personal blessings, and reframing comparisons toward self-improvement rather than self-evaluation. Fact 75. The neuroscience of romantic love, attachment's neural intoxication. Romantic love represents a powerful emotional motivational state with distinctive neural signatures that overlap substantially with addiction circuitry, leading some researchers to characterize it as a natural addiction. Functional neuroimaging of individuals viewing beloved partners' photographs reveals intense activation in the ventral tegmental area and caudate nucleus, dopamine-rich regions central to reward and motivation, while simultaneously showing deactivation in regions supporting negative emotions and social judgment. This pattern explains love's characteristic features: intense focus on the beloved, elevated mood in their presence, intrusive thinking about them, and diminished critical evaluation. The neurochemical profile involves elevated dopamine driving motivation and focused attention, norepinephrine increasing arousal and energy, decreased serotonin potentially explaining the obsessive thoughts characteristic of early love, and increased nerve growth factor during intense romantic periods. Oxytocin and vasopressin facilitate attachment formation and maintenance, with these neuropeptides surging during physical intimacy and promoting pair bonding. The temporal dynamics show evolution across relationship stages. Intense passionate love involving dopamine-driven reward activation gradually transitions to companionate love characterized by oxytocin-mediated attachment, with the former's intensity unsustainable beyond approximately 18 months. Cultural universality of romantic love, documented across numerous societies, suggests evolutionary origins, though cultural variation exists in whether romantic love constitutes acceptable marriage basis or represents disruptive force to be managed. Unrequited love produces neural activation patterns resembling cocaine craving, with heightened ventral tegmental area activity alongside activation in regions processing physical pain. Relationship dissolution triggers genuine withdrawal symptoms, intrusive thoughts, anxiety, depression, mediated by stress hormone systems and reduced reward sensitivity. Individual differences in attachment styles, secure, anxious, avoidant, predict relationship patterns and emotional experiences, with corresponding neural differences in regions supporting social cognition and emotion regulation. Understanding romantic love's neuroscience illuminates why it feels overwhelming and sometimes irrational, reflecting ancient brain systems rather than conscious choice. Fact 76. Emotional processing during sleep, nocturnal affective regulation. Sleep serves crucial emotion regulatory functions extending beyond rest and memory consolidation. During sleep, the brain actively processes emotional experiences from waking life, extracting their meaning while reducing their affective charge. REM sleep demonstrates particularly important emotional functions. The neurochemical environment during REM features high acetylcholine but decreased norepinephrine and serotonin, creating conditions potentially optimal for emotional memory reconsolidation. The amygdala shows heightened activity during REM despite cortical deactivation, suggesting emotional processing continues while executive control systems offline. The Sleep to Remember, Sleep to Forget framework proposes that sleep strengthens memory for emotional information's factual content while simultaneously stripping away the visceral emotional response, enabling integration of experiences without overwhelming reactivation. Consistent with this theory, sleep deprivation impairs emotional memory processing and next-day emotion regulation. Polysomnographic studies reveal that emotional stimuli before sleep produce more REM sleep and greater REM density, with the magnitude predicting reduced emotional reactivity upon re-exposure. However, sleep's emotion regulation can fail. PTSD characteristically involves nightmares that replay traumatic experiences with full emotional intensity rather than achieving normal resolution, suggesting fundamental disruption in sleep-dependent processing. The relationship operates bidirectionally. Emotional disturbance disrupts sleep architecture, while poor sleep impairs next-day emotion regulation, creating vicious cycles maintaining mood disorders. Insomnia independently predicts depression onset even controlling for baseline mood, suggesting sleep disturbance causes rather than merely reflects emotional pathology. Sleep's emotional functions likely explain why all mammals studied demonstrate sleep. The benefits of offline emotional processing outweigh vulnerability costs. Modern sleep deprivation epidemic, artificial lighting, electronic devices, irregular schedules, may contribute substantially to rising mental health problems through chronic disruption of sleep-dependent emotional processing. Interventions improving sleep consistently benefit mood, highlighting sleep's foundational role in emotional health. Fact 77. The emotional contagion of confidence and doubt. Meta-emotional transmission. Confidence and doubt constitute meta-emotional states, feelings about feelings or beliefs, that demonstrate powerful contagion properties with substantial consequences. When individuals express confidence, whether in personal abilities, factual claims, or predictions, they non-verbally transmit that confidence to observers through vocal tone, posture, and linguistic certainty markers. This confidence contagion operates largely automatically. People unconsciously adopt others' confidence levels as informational cues about accuracy, often without evaluating content independently. The neural mechanisms involve mentalizing networks, regions supporting inferences about others' mental states, integrating verbal content with confidence signals to estimate claim reliability. Problematic consequences arise because expressed confidence often correlates weakly with actual accuracy. Overconfident individuals appear more credible than appropriate, while knowledgeable but tentative individuals appear less credible. This creates selection pressures favoring overconfidence in leadership and persuasive contexts. Gender differences compound problems. Men typically express greater confidence than women for equivalent actual competence, contributing to perception gaps and advancement disparities. The illusion of explanatory depth demonstrates confidence contagion's dangers. People vastly overestimate their understanding of mechanisms like zippers or toilets until asked to explain step by step, yet maintain inflated confidence estimates based on superficial familiarity. Doubt similarly spreads contagiously. Observing others' uncertainty about beliefs can undermine previously firm convictions. The emotional valence differs. Confidence feels pleasant, motivating action, while doubt creates uncomfortable uncertainty that can either promote careful reasoning or paralyze decision-making. Social contexts strongly modulate effects. When groups contain overconfident members, their certainty disproportionately influences collective decisions even when they're wrong. Understanding confidence contagion has implications for identifying expertise. Genuine experts typically express appropriate uncertainty and nuance rather than overconfidence, and for examining one's own beliefs by separating actual evidence from contagiously acquired confidence. Modern media ecosystem rewards confident assertion over careful qualification, potentially degrading collective epistemology through confidence contagion dynamics favoring certainty over accuracy. Fact 78. The emotional experience of awe in vastness, self-transcendence through scale. Our experience is triggered by vastness, whether physical scale, canyons, oceans, cosmos, conceptual magnitude, evolutionary timescales, mathematical infinity, or social scope, mass movements, historical events, produce distinctive psychological states involving diminished self-focus and expanded perspective. The neurological signature includes decreased default mode network activity, particularly in regions supporting self-referential processing, explaining awe's characteristic small self feeling. Simultaneously, visual processing and attention networks show heightened activity as consciousness orients outward toward the awe-inspiring stimulus. The subjective experience involves feeling simultaneously insignificant yet connected to something larger, a paradoxical combination that proves psychologically beneficial. Experimental awe induction, through nature exposure, viewing cosmic imagery or contemplating vastness, produces measurable effects. Increased prosocial behavior, reduced materialism, greater life satisfaction, and diminished focus on personal concerns. Time perception expands during awe, with moments seeming to slow or dilate, possibly reflecting the cognitive accommodation required to assimilate schema-exceeding experiences. Individual differences exist in awe susceptibility. Those higher in openness to experience report more frequent awe and show stronger responses. Cultural differences emerge in which stimuli trigger awe. Western individualistic cultures often emphasize natural or scientific sources, while collectivist cultures more frequently cite social or moral exemplars. The emotional tone of awe includes positive feelings, wonder, amazement, admiration, but also elements of fear or overwhelm when vastness includes threat dimensions. Modern life offers both unprecedented awe opportunities, access to cosmic imagery, global connectivity, and awe deprivation through diminished nature exposure and increasingly mediated, screen-based experience that rarely provides genuinely transcendent scale. Deliberately cultivating awe experiences may represent an underutilized strategy for combating the narcissistic self-focus and materialistic values that predict lower well-being, offering emotional antidote through perspective-shifting encounters with vastness. Fact 79. The neuroscience of guilt and moral repair, emotions that restore social bonds. Guilt serves as a self-conscious moral emotion motivating reparative action following transgressions, distinguishing it from shame's global self-condemnation and withdrawal tendencies. The neural basis involves anterior temporal cortex and superior temporal sulcus, regions supporting theory of mind and understanding others' perspectives, suggesting guilt requires modeling how one's actions affected others. This cognitive emotional integration recruits connections between prefrontal regions supporting moral reasoning and limbic structures generating negative affect. The anterior cingulate cortex, sensitive to social pain and conflict, also activates during guilt experiences. Guilt's discomfort motivates confession, apology, and behavioral repair, actions that can restore damaged relationships and reinforce moral norms. Developmental trajectories show guilt emerging between ages 2 and 3, requiring cognitive sophistication including self-awareness, internalized standards, and perspective-taking capacity. Individual differences in guilt proneness predict empathy and prosocial orientation. Guilt-prone people demonstrate more relationship investment and cooperative behavior. However, excessive or chronic guilt becomes maladaptive, particularly when individuals assume responsibility for outcomes beyond their control or when no reparative action exists. This dysfunctional guilt maintains depression and anxiety without serving adaptive functions. Cultural variation exists in guilt's social role. Individualistic cultures emphasizing personal responsibility and interpersonal transgressions utilize guilt prominently, while collectivist cultures sometimes employ shame more centrally as regulatory emotion. The distinction between appropriate guilt motivating correction and neurotic guilt generating rumination without resolution guides clinical interventions. Psychopathy involves profound guilt deficits. Psychopathic individuals show reduced anterior insula and anterior cingulate responses to moral violations, explaining their capacity for harmful behavior without emotional distress. Understanding guilt's adaptive functions while recognizing its potential pathologies enables leveraging this emotion's prosocial benefits, relationship maintenance through acknowledgement and repair, while identifying and treating instances where guilt becomes self-destructive or functionally useless. Fact 80. Emotional regulation through expressive writing, Pennebaker's therapeutic disclosure. Expressive writing about emotional experiences produces measurable psychological and physical health benefits through mechanisms that remain partially mysterious despite extensive research. James Pennebaker's seminal studies assign participants to write about deeply personal traumatic experiences for 15 to 20 minutes across several days, compared to control groups writing about neutral topics. Expressive writing groups showed superior outcomes across diverse measures: fewer physician visits, improved immune function, better academic performance, enhanced mood, and reduced psychological symptoms. The effect sizes, while modest, appear robust across numerous replications and populations. The mechanisms likely involve multiple pathways. Writing facilitates cognitive processing of difficult experiences through narrative construction that imposes order on chaotic events, enables habitual inhibition reduction as hidden experiences are expressed, promotes emotional habituation through repeated exposure to distressing memories in safe contexts, and supports cognitive reappraisal as new perspectives emerge through writing. Linguistic analysis reveals that beneficial writing shows increasing use of causal and insight words across sessions, suggesting that meaning-making rather than mere emotional venting drives benefits. Importantly, immediate effects are often negative. Writing about trauma initially increases distress, but longer-term benefits emerge over subsequent weeks. Not all writing approaches prove equivalent. Simply venting emotions without cognitive processing shows weaker benefits than writing that integrates feelings with meaning-making. Individual differences moderate effects. Those with higher baseline inhibition and those experiencing more severe trauma show larger benefits. Cultural factors also matter. Individualistic cultures emphasizing personal disclosure show stronger effects than collectivist cultures where emotional expression may conflict with self-presentation norms. The intervention's simplicity and low cost make it potentially valuable as adjunct treatment, though it shouldn't replace other treatments for serious conditions. Understanding expressive writing's effectiveness illuminates broader principles about emotional processing requiring both experiencing and comprehending feelings, integrating emotional and cognitive operations for optimal adaptation. Fact 81. The emotional effects of nature deficit. Modern disconnection's psychological cost. Contemporary urbanization and indoor-focused lifestyles create unprecedented disconnection from natural environments with measurable psychological consequences. The average person now spends over 90% of time indoors, a dramatic shift from ancestral environments where continuous nature immersion constituted normal existence. This nature deficit correlates with elevated rates of attention problems, anxiety, depression, and reduced life satisfaction. The mechanisms underlying nature's benefits include attention restoration. Natural environments engage effortless, soft fascination, allowing directed attention resources to recover, and stress reduction through parasympathetic nervous system activation triggered by natural stimuli. Additionally, nature exposure reduces rumination, the repetitive negative thinking maintaining depression. Neuroimaging reveals that nature walks reduce activity in subgenual prefrontal cortex regions associated with depression and rumination. Microbiome effects may contribute. Reduced exposure to environmental microorganisms that trained human immune systems across evolutionary history potentially increases inflammatory and autoimmune conditions that affect mood. The specific features mattering include biodiversity. More species-rich environments confer greater benefits. Water features which universally attract attention and generate positive effect, and greenness measured through vegetation density. Dose-response relationships exist. Even brief nature exposures produce benefits, with approximately 120 minutes weekly emerging as a threshold for substantial well-being effects. Urban green space access predicts mental health at population levels. Neighborhoods with more parks show lower depression rates even controlling for socioeconomic factors. Children particularly suffer from nature deficit, with outdoor play restrictions correlating with rising attention problems and declining creative play. Modern technology exacerbates disconnection by providing indoor entertainment alternatives that ancestrally didn't exist. The irony is that as humans gain technological mastery over nature, we've engineered environments increasingly divorced from the natural world our emotional systems evolved within, essentially performing an uncontrolled psychological experiment with unclear long-term consequences. Addressing nature deficit requires both individual behavior change, prioritizing outdoor time, and urban planning integrating accessible green space. Fact 82. The psychology of forgiveness. Releasing resentment's emotional burden. Forgiveness involves deliberately releasing feelings of resentment and thoughts of revenge toward those who have caused harm, a psychological process with measurable emotional and physical health consequences. Research distinguishes forgiveness from condoning, accepting the wrongdoing as acceptable, excusing, providing justifications, forgetting, losing awareness of the transgression, or reconciling, restoring the relationship, though these sometimes co-occur. The emotional benefits of forgiveness accrue primarily to the forgiver rather than the transgressor. Those who forgive show reduced anxiety, depression, and hostility, alongside improved cardiovascular function and stress hormone profiles. The mechanism involves releasing the chronic stress associated with maintaining grudges. Persistent anger and rumination about injustice activate stress response systems, producing wear and tear effects over time. Neuroimaging reveals that forgiveness activates regions supporting perspective taking and empathy while reducing activation in anger-related circuits. The process typically involves stages: acknowledging hurt and its effects, making the decision to forgive as a gift to oneself, working on understanding perpetrator context without excusing behavior, finding meaning or growth opportunities from the experience, and discovering compassion for oneself and the transgressor. Not all situations demand forgiveness. Severe betrayals or ongoing abuse don't require forgiveness for victims' well-being, and pressuring forgiveness can constitute additional harm. Cultural and religious variation exists. Christianity emphasizes forgiveness as divine command, while other traditions stress justice over mercy. Individual differences in forgiveness propensity correlate with agreeableness, empathy, and religiosity. Importantly, self-forgiveness, releasing guilt and self-condemnation following one's own transgressions, appears equally important for well-being, though requires different processes including accepting responsibility, making amends where possible, and committing to behavior change. The challenge involves balancing forgiveness's healing potential against justice needs and self-protection. Premature forgiveness can enable continued harm, while chronic unforgiveness poisons well-being. Understanding forgiveness as a tool for releasing emotional burdens rather than a moral obligation or relationship requirement enables selective, thoughtful application. Fact 83. Emotional responses to music, universal and culturally specific components. Music's capacity to evoke powerful emotions appears universal across human cultures, yet the specific emotional meanings attached to musical features show substantial cultural variation. Cross-cultural research reveals that listeners can identify basic emotional intentions in unfamiliar musical traditions with above-chance accuracy, recognizing happy, sad, and fearful music from cultures they've never encountered. This suggests universal acoustic emotion mappings. Rapid tempos, ascending pitch, major tonalities, and rhythmic regularity reliably signal positive high-arousal emotions, while slow tempos, descending pitch, minor tonalities, and irregular rhythms convey sadness. These patterns likely derive from vocal emotional expression. Angry speech is loud and harsh, sad speech is quiet and low-pitched, creating cross-modal correspondences that music exploits. However, cultural learning profoundly shapes musical emotion. Familiarity with specific musical idioms enhances emotional response and recognition accuracy. Neuroimaging reveals music engages extensive brain regions including auditory cortex processing acoustic features, motor regions tracking rhythm, hippocampal regions supporting memory associations, and crucially limbic and reward regions generating emotional responses. Pleasurable music triggers dopamine release in striatum comparable to other natural rewards, explaining music's hedonic power. Individual differences in musical emotional sensitivity correlate with openness to experience and empathy. The Breakups framework identifies mechanisms underlying musical emotions: brainstem reflexes to sudden or loud sounds, rhythmic entrainment synchronizing physiological processes, evaluative conditioning where music becomes associated with emotional events, emotional contagion from performer or lyrical content, visual imagery evoked by music, episodic memory associations, musical expectation violations, and aesthetic appreciation of beauty. These multiple pathways explain music's diverse emotional effects and why different listeners respond differently to identical music based on their unique learning histories, current contexts, and individual sensitivities. Music's emotional power has implications ranging from therapeutic applications to emotional manipulation through film scoring and advertising. Fact 84. The emotional architecture of shame, social exposure's paralyzing effect. Shame represents a particularly toxic self-conscious emotion involving global negative self-evaluation and desires to hide or disappear, distinguished from guilt's focus on specific behaviors. The subjective experience involves excruciating self-consciousness, feeling exposed and defective, imagining others' contempt, and overwhelming urges to conceal or escape. Shame activates neural regions including the anterior cingulate cortex processing social pain, alongside prefrontal regions supporting self-evaluation. The response patterns include gaze aversion, slumped posture, and social withdrawal, behaviors reducing social exposure but also preventing opportunities for social repair. This withdrawal tendency distinguishes shame from guilt, which motivates reparative approach. Shame proneness predicts numerous maladaptive outcomes: depression, anxiety, eating disorders, aggression, shame's humiliation variant, and substance abuse. The mechanisms involve shame's attack on global self-worth, which unlike specific behavior failures seems unfixable, generating hopelessness. Additionally, shame's social isolation tendency prevents receipt of the social support and alternative perspectives that might challenge negative self-evaluations. Developmental origins involve childhood experiences of ridicule, harsh criticism, or abuse that communicate, "you are bad" rather than "you did something bad." Cultural variation exists dramatically. Collectivist cultures emphasizing group harmony and face-saving utilize shame more prominently as social regulator than individualistic cultures. However, even in shame-oriented cultures, social support systems often exist to help individuals restore face, whereas modern Western shame often occurs without supportive reintegration rituals. The distinction between shame and stigma proves important. Shame is internalized negative self-evaluation, while stigma is external social devaluation. Though they interact as stigmatized individuals often internalize society's negative evaluations. Therapeutic approaches target shame's cognitive distortions, foster self-compassion as antidote, and create corrective emotional experiences through accepting therapeutic relationships. Understanding shame's toxicity enables distinguishing it from the more adaptive guilt while recognizing situations where shame's social regulation function operates versus where it becomes destructive force, maintaining psychopathology and preventing help-seeking through fear of exposure. Fact 85. The neuroscience of emotional memories, why feelings stick. Emotionally arousing events create stronger, more persistent memories than neutral experiences through neurobiological mechanisms ensuring survival-relevant information receives preferential encoding and storage. The process begins with amygdala activation during emotional experiences. This almond-shaped structure detects emotional significance and modulates memory consolidation in the hippocampus. Stress hormones released during emotional arousal, including cortisol and epinephrine, enhance consolidation through both direct brain effects and indirect modulation via vagal nerve signaling. This creates a dose-response relationship where moderate emotional arousal optimally enhances memory, while extreme stress can impair encoding. The result is that emotional memories demonstrate superior retention across time. You're more likely to remember your first kiss than what you ate for lunch last Tuesday. However, emotional memory enhancement isn't uniform. Central details of emotional experiences, the threat source, the beloved's face, receive prioritized encoding, while peripheral details may actually show impaired memory, creating tunnel memory focused on emotional core. This selectivity served evolutionary functions. Remembering precisely what threatened you mattered more than surrounding irrelevant details. Importantly, emotional memory isn't more accurate than neutral memory despite feeling more vivid and confident. Studies of flashbulb memories, vivid recollections of shocking events like disasters, reveal they contain as many errors as ordinary memories despite subjective certainty. The mechanisms involve amygdala enhancement creating strong memory traces without improving accuracy. PTSD represents pathological emotional memory where traumatic experiences are over-consolidated and remain hyper-accessible, intruding into consciousness involuntarily. Therapeutic approaches exploit memory reconsolidation, the process where retrieved memories temporarily become labeled and can be updated, attempting to reduce emotional charge through techniques like exposure therapy or pharmacological interventions during retrieval windows. Understanding emotional memory mechanisms illuminates why emotional experiences disproportionately shape autobiographical narratives and identity, for better or worse, and why interventions targeting emotional memory hold therapeutic promise. Fact 86. The emotional effects of economic inequality, relative deprivation's psychic toll. Economic inequality exerts psychological effects independent of absolute poverty, with inequality itself predicting population-level mental health, violence, and social dysfunction. The status anxiety hypothesis proposes that large gaps between rich and poor create chronic social evaluative threat, as individuals constantly face unfavorable comparisons highlighting their relative position. This generates shame about low status and anxiety about maintaining status, with these emotions correlating with stress hormone dysregulation, inflammation, and mental health problems. Neuroimaging research reveals that processing information about economic inequality activates threat-related amygdala and anterior insular responses, suggesting inequality registers as psychological threat. The mechanisms involve multiple pathways. Inequality reduces social cohesion and trust as social distances expand, creates zero-sum competition mindsets where others' gains feel like personal losses, and amplifies materialistic values as status markers become more salient. Subjective social status, where one perceives oneself within the hierarchy, predicts health and well-being more strongly than objective measures, suggesting psychological interpretation mediates inequality's effects. However, objective inequality constrains possibilities for positive self-evaluation. In highly unequal societies, more people inevitably occupy obviously inferior positions. Cross-national comparisons reveal that more equal societies show better population health, higher trust, lower violence, and superior child well-being even when controlling for average wealth. Within the United States, more unequal states show worse outcomes across metrics. The emotional consequences extend beyond those at hierarchy's bottom. High inequality increases status anxiety throughout the distribution as the gap between enough and falling behind expands. Extremely wealthy individuals in unequal contexts report happiness levels only marginally higher than middle-class individuals in equal societies, suggesting inequality creates hedonic treadmills benefiting no one. Proposed interventions include progressive taxation, stronger safety nets, and consumption taxes on luxury goods, though political feasibility remains contentious. Understanding inequalities' emotional effects highlights how economic structure shapes psychological well-being beyond simple resource availability. Fact 87. The psychology of hope and hopelessness, future expectancies. Emotional valence. Hope and hopelessness constitute emotional cognitive states oriented toward the future, with profound impacts on present motivation, perseverance, and well-being. Hope involves expectancies that desired outcomes are possible combined with perceived agency to influence those outcomes, a cognitive emotional package that simultaneously feels good and energizes action. The neural basis includes activation of regions supporting reward anticipation, goal representation, and action planning, creating an integrated system linking future imagination with present motivation. Hopeful individuals demonstrate superior performance across domains including academics, athletics, and health outcomes through behavioral mechanisms, greater effort investment, persistence during obstacles, generation of alternative routes to goals when primary paths fail. The neurochemistry involves dopaminergic pathways supporting motivation and reward anticipation. Importantly, adaptive hope requires realism. Unrealistic optimism divorced from actual probabilities can lead to poor decisions and eventual demoralization when impossible expectations inevitably fail. Hopelessness represents hope's catastrophic opposite, involving expectations that desired outcomes are impossible and one's actions cannot improve the situation, the cognitive core of depression. This state involves reduced activity in reward and motivation circuits alongside increased default mode and rumination network activity. Hopelessness powerfully predicts suicidal behavior independent of depression severity, suggesting beliefs about future possibility crucially influence whether individuals can tolerate present suffering. The learned helplessness model demonstrates how repeated experiences of uncontrollable outcomes can induce hopelessness and depression-like states in both animals and humans. However, controllable challenges can inoculate against helplessness by establishing expectations of efficacy. Cultural and contextual factors profoundly shape hope. Structural oppression that objectively limits opportunities can make hope psychologically protective yet potentially politically problematic if it individualizes responsibility for circumstances beyond personal control. Nevertheless, maintaining some hope appears psychologically essential. Humans seem to require belief in possible positive futures to sustain present effort and well-being. Therapeutic interventions target hopelessness through challenging catastrophic predictions, identifying realistic goals and pathways toward them, and building self-efficacy through graduated success experiences. Fact 88. Emotional responses to artificial intelligence, anxiety and wonder at machine minds. The emergence of increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence triggers complex emotional responses combining wonder at technological capability, anxiety about displacement and control, and philosophical unease about consciousness and humanity's unique status. Psychological research reveals that people respond emotionally to AI systems despite knowing their non-sentient nature. Anthropomorphism leads to attributing mental states to machines, triggering social emotions like trust, anger, or gratitude toward AI agents. The uncanny valley phenomenon demonstrates emotional discomfort arising from human-like but not quite human entities, with near-human AI generating negative effect compared to clearly mechanical or fully human-seeming systems. Anxiety about AI focuses on multiple threats: economic displacement as automation eliminates jobs, existential risk from superintelligent systems potentially pursuing goals misaligned with human welfare, privacy concerns about surveillance and data exploitation, and deeper worries about meaning and purpose if machines can accomplish any cognitive task. These anxieties activate threat detection systems including amygdala responses to AI-related content. Conversely, positive emotions arise from AI's assistive potential: medical diagnostics, scientific discovery, personalized education, and from the intellectual wonder at creating intelligence in silicon. Individual differences exist in AI attitudes correlating with technological optimism, science fiction exposure, and personality dimensions. Cultural variation emerges between technology-embracing attitudes in some Asian cultures versus more skeptical European perspectives. The emotional responses to AI reflect deeper values and concerns. Those emphasizing human uniqueness feel more threatened by AI demonstrating human-like capabilities, while those viewing intelligence as information processing regardless of substrate feel less existential anxiety. The emotional landscape will likely intensify as AI systems become more capable and integrated into daily life. Understanding these emotional responses proves important for both individual adaptation and collective policymaking around AI development and deployment. The psychological challenge involves maintaining appropriate caution about genuine risks while avoiding either complacent dismissal or paralyzing technophobia, calibrating emotional responses to actual rather than imagined dangers and opportunities. Fact 89. The emotional dimension of rituals, structures comfort and meaning. Rituals, formalized, repeated behavioral sequences invested with symbolic meaning, serve powerful emotional functions across religious, secular, and personal domains. The psychological effects include anxiety reduction through providing structure and predictability, enhanced sense of control through prescribed actions during uncertainty, emotional processing through formalized expression, social bonding through collective participation, and meaning-making through symbolic representation of values and transitions. Neuroscience reveals that ritual participation activates reward circuitry and reduces activity in brain regions associated with anxiety and uncertainty. The specific features mattering include repetition, which creates familiarity and automaticity, rigidity, where precise execution feels important, and redundancy, using multiple modalities to convey meaning. Interestingly, even arbitrary rituals, invented procedures with no objective efficacy, can reduce anxiety and improve performance when individuals believe in their effectiveness. This demonstrates rituals' psychological rather than magical power. Collective rituals powerfully enhance social cohesion. Synchronized ritual movements produce the interpersonal bonding effects discussed earlier, while shared symbolic systems create common identity. Major life transitions across cultures feature rituals marking passages, births, coming of age, marriages, deaths, that help individuals and communities process changes. The emotional support during weddings or funerals comes partly from the ritual structure providing behavioral scripts when people might otherwise feel paralyzed by emotion. Personal rituals, even idiosyncratic ones like pre-performance routines, provide psychological benefits through creating sense of agency and reducing uncertainty-related anxiety. Modern life's decline in shared ritual participation, reduced religious affiliation, fragmented communities, individualized lifestyles, may deprive people of rituals' emotional benefits. However, new rituals emerge around sports fandom, holiday traditions, and even social media practices, suggesting humans' persistent need for ritualized behavior. Understanding rituals' emotional functions enables distinguishing adaptive from maladaptive ritualization. Healthy rituals provide comfort and connection, while obsessive-compulsive rituals represent anxiety-driven behaviors causing impairment. The key distinctions involve flexibility, functionality, and whether rituals serve values or merely reduce distress temporarily. Fact 90. The neuroscience of empathic distress, when sharing pain becomes overwhelming. Empathic distress represents a state where vicariously experiencing others' suffering becomes so intense that it generates personal distress and withdrawal rather than compassionate helping. This represents empathy's dark side, the maladaptive extreme of emotional resonance. When observing intense suffering, particularly if prolonged or uncontrollable, the same pain processing networks that enable empathic understanding can become overwhelmed, triggering threat responses and avoidance. Neuroimaging reveals that empathic distress involves heightened amygdala and anterior insula activation without corresponding prefrontal regulation, creating emotional flooding similar to personal threat responses. The distinction between empathy and compassion proves crucial. Empathy involves resonating with others' feelings, feeling what they feel, while compassion involves caring concern without necessarily sharing the emotional state, feeling for them. Compassion meditation practices cultivate the latter by generating warm feelings toward suffering beings while maintaining boundaries preventing emotional overwhelm. Neuroscience demonstrates these are distinct processes. Compassion activates different circuits than empathy, particularly reward-related regions associated with caregiving motivation. Healthcare workers, therapists, and others professionally exposed to suffering face high risks of empathic distress leading to compassion fatigue and burnout. The mechanisms involve sustained vicarious trauma exposure depleting regulatory resources while accumulating stress response activation. Surprisingly, higher trait empathy sometimes predicts worse outcomes in helping professions, as those who resonate most intensely with suffering experience greatest personal distress. Training programs increasingly emphasize cultivating compassion over empathy. Maintaining caring concern while regulating personal distress enables sustainable helping. Individual differences exist. Those with better emotion regulation capacity maintain empathic engagement without becoming overwhelmed. The balance between remaining emotionally open to others' experiences while maintaining sufficient boundaries to avoid personal flooding represents a sophisticated emotional skill. Understanding empathic distress as neuroscience enables caregivers to recognize warning signs and implement protective strategies, potentially extending career longevity while maintaining high-quality care. Fact 91. Emotional responses to mortality salience, death awareness shaping life. Reminders of mortality, death salience, trigger powerful emotional and psychological responses that profoundly influence values, behaviors, and worldviews. Terror management theory proposes that human awareness of inevitable death creates existential anxiety that cultures manage through providing symbolic immortality via cultural worldviews and self-esteem. Research demonstrates that subtle mortality reminders, even subconscious ones, systematically alter behavior, increasing defense of cultural values, enhancing in-group preference while derogating outgroups, boosting materialism and status striving, and intensifying religiosity. The mechanisms involve anxiety buffering systems. Cultural worldviews and self-esteem provide psychological protection against death anxiety. When mortality becomes salient, people defensively protect these anxiety buffers through worldview defense and self-esteem striving. Neuroimaging reveals mortality salience activates threat detection networks including the amygdala, alongside regions supporting emotion regulation and cognitive control as individuals manage anxiety. Interestingly, mortality salience effects show temporal dynamics. Immediate conscious awareness of death paradoxically can increase prosocial behavior and present focus, while delayed subliminal reminders produce the defensive worldview effects. This suggests different psychological processes: conscious contemplation versus unconscious anxiety defense. Individual differences exist. Secure attachment and intrinsic goal orientation buffer against defensive responses, while anxious attachment and extrinsic goal focus amplify them. The COVID-19 pandemic created sustained mortality salience, likely contributing to observed increases in anxiety, political polarization, and both conspicuous consumption and meaningful relationship focus, seemingly contradictory responses reflecting different coping strategies. Constructive responses to mortality awareness include prioritizing meaningful relationships over material pursuits, clarifying authentic values, and increasing present-moment engagement. Existential psychotherapy deliberately uses mortality awareness to motivate authentic living rather than defensive avoidance. Understanding mortality salience effects illuminates how fundamental human psychological architecture, the uniquely human awareness of finite existence, shapes everyday emotional life and social behavior in ways we rarely consciously recognize. Fact 92. The emotional impact of silence and solitude, quiet's double edge. Silence and solitude produce complex emotional effects varying dramatically based on whether they're chosen or imposed, duration, and individual differences. Chosen solitude provides opportunities for emotional restoration, self-reflection, creativity, and spiritual experience. The neural correlates involve reduced stimulation allowing default mode network activation, supporting introspection and self-referential processing. Brief solitude facilitates emotional regulation by removing social performance demands and providing space to process experiences. Contemplative traditions across cultures recognize solitude's value for psychological and spiritual development. However, prolonged or involuntary isolation produces opposite effects: loneliness, depression, anxiety, and even hallucinations. Solitary confinement constitutes psychological torture, with documented effects including emotional volatility, hallucinations, cognitive impairment, and lasting trauma. The neural mechanisms involve disruption of social brain networks and stress response system dysregulation. The dose-response relationship suggests moderate solitude benefits well-being while excessive isolation harms it, though individual differences create substantial variation in optimal amounts. Introverts typically prefer and benefit from more solitude than extroverts, who find prolonged isolation more aversive. Cultural factors influence solitude's meaning. Individualistic cultures often frame solitude as opportunity for self-discovery, while collectivist cultures may emphasize its abnormality or loneliness. Modern life creates paradoxes: simultaneous unprecedented isolation through single-person households and geographic mobility, alongside unprecedented difficulty accessing genuine solitude through constant connectivity and environmental noise. Many people rarely experience complete silence or uninterrupted alone time, potentially depriving themselves of solitude's restorative benefits. Conversely, others experience chronic loneliness despite living in densely populated areas, demonstrating that solitude and loneliness represent distinct experiences, one about chosen aloneness, the other about unwanted disconnection. Practices like meditation, nature immersion, and digital fasts deliberately cultivate beneficial solitude, recognizing its emotional value as counterbalance to contemporary life's social intensity and informational density. Understanding solitude's emotional effects enables intentional orchestration of social solitary balance rather than passive acceptance of whatever contemporary life delivers. Fact 93. The emotional underpinnings of political orientation affect shaping ideology. Political orientations demonstrate systematic associations with emotional characteristics and neural responses that challenge purely rational models of political belief formation. Research reveals that conservatives and liberals differ on average in trait emotionality. Conservatives score higher on threat sensitivity, disgust sensitivity, and fear responses, while liberals score higher on openness to experience and tolerance of ambiguity. Neuroimaging reveals that conservatives show larger amygdala volumes and stronger amygdala responses to threatening stimuli, while liberals show increased anterior cingulate cortex activity associated with conflict monitoring and updating beliefs. These differences likely reflect reciprocal causation, emotional predispositions influencing political attraction, while political socialization shapes emotional responses. Moral foundations theory proposes that liberals and conservatives emphasize different moral values corresponding to distinct emotional concerns. Conservatives relatively equally weight care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, while liberals emphasize care and fairness more exclusively. These differing moral matrices create divergent emotional responses to identical political issues. Immigration might trigger fairness concerns for liberals but authority and loyalty concerns for conservatives, generating different emotional reactions and policy preferences. Disgust particularly predicts conservative positions on sexuality and purity-related issues, while empathic concern predicts liberal positions on social welfare. Political messaging exploits these emotional foundations. Conservative rhetoric emphasizes threat, tradition, and in-group loyalty, while liberal rhetoric emphasizes compassion and social justice. The emotional basis of politics helps explain its intractability. Political disputes feel like deeply emotional, values-based conflicts rather than merely intellectual disagreements. Attempts at purely rational persuasion typically fail because they don't address underlying emotional responses. However, the emotional foundations aren't immutable. Life experiences, particularly those generating fear or safety, can shift political orientations through altering emotional sensitivities. Understanding politics' emotional underpinnings doesn't reduce ideology to emotion but rather recognizes that values, emotions, and cognition interact in producing political worldviews. The implications include recognizing one's own emotional basis for positions, understanding opponents' emotional logic rather than assuming irrationality, and crafting political appeals that address emotional as well as intellectual dimensions. Fact 94. The neuroscience of curiosity, knowledge-seeking's emotional drive. Curiosity represents an emotional motivational state driving information seeking and exploration, serving crucial adaptive functions through promoting learning and discovery. The neural basis involves dopaminergic reward circuits. Curiosity triggers anticipatory reward responses as the brain predicts forthcoming information's value. Functional neuroimaging reveals that when curiosity is piqued, the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens activate before information is provided, suggesting curiosity generates intrinsic reward anticipation. This reward circuitry explains why satisfying curiosity feels pleasurable and why humans sometimes seek information even when it has no practical value or might contain unwelcome content. The hippocampus shows enhanced activity during high curiosity states, creating neurobiological conditions optimal for memory formation. We remember better when curious. This creates positive feedback loops. Curiosity enhances learning. Successful learning satisfies curiosity and rewards information seeking, encouraging further curiosity. Two types exist: perceptual curiosity triggered by novel, complex, or ambiguous stimuli, and epistemic curiosity motivated by desire for knowledge independent of immediate sensation. Both involve reward systems but recruit different additional networks. Individual differences in trait curiosity correlate with openness to experience, cognitive ability, and creativity. Interestingly, moderate uncertainty optimizes curiosity, too little information fails to engage interest, while overwhelming information generates anxiety rather than curiosity, creating an inverted U relationship. This explains why effective teaching piques curiosity through presenting information gaps that feel bridgeable. Modern information environments create both opportunities and challenges for curiosity. Unprecedented information access can satisfy curiosity, but algorithmic curation sometimes creates filter bubbles limiting exposure to curiosity-piquing novelty. Additionally, clickbait exploits curiosity through creating information gaps. You won't believe what happened next, while delivering unsatisfying answers, potentially training dysfunctional curiosity patterns. Understanding curiosity's neuroscience enables designing educational experiences that leverage its motivational power while recognizing individual variation in what triggers interest and optimal information challenge levels. Fact 95. Emotional consequences of social media use. Digital connection's psychological price. Social media platforms create novel emotional environments with measurable psychological consequences distinct from traditional social interaction. Research consistently documents associations between heavy social media use and elevated rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and poor sleep, particularly among adolescents. The mechanisms involve multiple pathways: social comparison with curated presentations generating envy and inadequacy feelings, fear of missing out, FOMO, creating anxiety about excluded experiences, reduced face-to-face interaction depriving users of richer emotional communication, sleep disruption through nighttime use and blue light exposure, cyberbullying enabling unprecedented harassment reach, attention fragmentation preventing deep engagement, and addictive design features exploiting dopaminergic reward systems. However, the relationship shows complexity. Correlation doesn't establish causation, and effects vary dramatically across individuals. Some evidence suggests reverse causation. Those already struggling socially or emotionally may use social media more heavily, seeking connection or distraction. Active use, posting, messaging, meaningful engagement, produces different effects than passive scrolling. Active use can enhance well-being through maintaining relationships, while passive consumption correlates with negative outcomes through comparison and exclusion feelings. Platform architecture profoundly shapes emotional impacts. Instagram's visual focus on curated lifestyle presentation may generate more comparison-based distress than Twitter's text focus, while TikTok's algorithmic engagement creates different attentional patterns. The neurobiological effects include altered reward sensitivity, with social media notifications triggering dopamine releases that reinforce compulsive checking. Adolescent brains, still developing prefrontal regulatory capacity, show particular vulnerability. Individual differences moderate impacts. Those with low self-esteem, high social anxiety, or poor offline social support show stronger negative effects. Cultural factors also matter, with collectivist cultures potentially experiencing more social comparison pressure. Emerging evidence suggests that limiting social media use to approximately 30 minutes daily substantially reduces depression and loneliness compared to unlimited use. Understanding social media's emotional effects enables more intentional use, cultivating active engagement, monitoring emotional responses, setting time limits, and recognizing when digital connection substitutes destructively for face-to-face interaction. Fact 96. The emotional architecture of procrastination. Task avoidance's effective basis. Procrastination involves voluntarily delaying intended actions despite expecting to be worse off for the delay, representing a puzzle for rational models but making sense within emotional frameworks. Rather than mere time management failure, procrastination represents emotion regulation gone awry. People prioritize short-term mood repair over long-term goal pursuit. The immediate aversiveness of starting difficult, boring, or anxiety-provoking tasks triggers avoidance motivated by relieving that negative effect. Procrastination provides temporary mood improvement through escaping unpleasant task emotions, creating negative reinforcement that strengthens the pattern despite eventual stress when deadlines loom. Neuroimaging reveals procrastination correlates with amygdala volume and reduced connectivity between amygdala and prefrontal regulatory regions, suggesting difficulty overriding emotionally driven avoidance. The temporal discounting phenomenon, where immediate rewards feel more valuable than larger delayed rewards, contributes. Procrastination's immediate relief outweighs eventual consequences because emotional salience decays with temporal distance. Perfectionism paradoxically drives procrastination. Excessively high standards make task initiation threatening, as any execution will fall short of ideals. The resulting performance anxiety triggers avoidance rather than productivity. Task characteristics predicting procrastination include lack of structure, distant deadlines, low intrinsic interest, and high difficulty. Individual differences exist. Trait procrastinators show higher impulsivity, lower conscientiousness, and poorer emotion regulation. However, situational procrastination occurs in otherwise organized individuals when facing particularly aversive tasks. The emotional consequences include initial relief followed by mounting anxiety, shame, and self-criticism as deadlines approach, creating vicious cycles where task-associated negative emotions intensify, increasing future procrastination likelihood. Effective interventions address emotional rather than merely organizational factors, reducing task aversiveness through breaking work into small, manageable steps, implementing commitment devices removing temptation, practicing self-compassion to reduce shame-based paralysis, and addressing underlying perfectionism or anxiety. Understanding procrastination's emotional basis replaces unhelpful moral judgments with practical strategies targeting the effective mechanisms maintaining the pattern. Fact 97. The neuroscience of moral disgust, contamination concerns extended to ethics. Disgust, originally evolved to protect against pathogen transmission through rejecting contaminated substances, has been co-opted to serve moral functions through metaphorical extension. Moral disgust involves visceral revulsion toward ethical violations, corruption, betrayal, cruelty, recruiting the same neural systems, anterior insula orbitofrontal cortex, that process physical disgust toward rotten food or bodily fluids. This neural overlap explains why moral violations are described using contamination language, dirty politicians, corrupt practices, tainted evidence. The extension likely occurred because social pathogens, norm violators who might exploit or harm, posed threats analogous to biological pathogens, allowing the evolved disgust system to expand its protective function. Individual differences in disgust sensitivity correlate with moral attitudes, particularly regarding sexuality and purity concerns. Those with higher disgust sensitivity endorse more conservative positions on sexual practices, drug use, and immigration. The political implications are substantial. Conservatives show on average higher disgust sensitivity than liberals, possibly contributing to their emphasis on tradition, authority, and sanctity. Moral disgust influences behavior powerfully. It motivates distancing from moral transgressors, punishment of norm violators, and contagion-like avoidance of those associated with transgressors. The emotional intensity of moral disgust creates certainty and resistance to perspective taking. Disgust shuts down deliberative processing in favor of immediate rejection. This serves functions, rapid rejection of genuine threats, but creates vulnerabilities, dehumanization of outgroups, excessive punishment, moral rigidity. Cultural variation exists in which violations trigger moral disgust. Individualistic cultures emphasize harm-based violations, while collectivist cultures extend disgust to loyalty and authority transgressions. The embodied cognition perspective suggests that physical cleansing can reduce moral disgust's effects. The Macbeth effect, where handwashing symbolically purges moral taint. Understanding moral disgust illuminates how ancient emotion systems shape modern moral judgment, for better and worse, creating intuitive ethical responses that bypass rational deliberation while sometimes promoting excessive moral condemnation and outgroup derogation. Fact 98. Emotional responses to climate change, ecological anxiety and hope. Climate change generates complex emotional responses including anxiety about environmental futures, grief over ecological losses, guilt about personal contribution and anger toward political inaction, collectively termed eco-anxiety or climate distress. These emotional responses, while uncomfortable, often reflect appropriate concern about genuine threats rather than pathological anxiety. Surveys document rising climate anxiety particularly among youth, who face inheriting environmental damage they didn't create. The emotional impact operates through multiple pathways: direct experiences of climate-related disasters, wildfires, floods, extreme heat, creating trauma and fear, gradual environmental changes generating solastalgia, grief over familiar landscapes transformation, awareness of future threats producing anticipatory anxiety, and feelings of helplessness when individual actions seem inadequate against systemic problems. Neuroscience research on environmental concerns remains limited but suggests that climate information activates threat processing networks while simultaneously triggering regulatory systems attempting to manage distress through denial, minimization, or problem-focused coping. The emotional responses show interesting patterns. Abstract statistical information about future warming elicits less emotional response than concrete images of suffering animals or people, despite the former representing greater objective threats. This reflects evolved psychology's emphasis on proximate, vivid threats over distant, abstract dangers. Individual differences exist in climate anxiety levels, correlating with environmental values, political orientation, and trait anxiety. Cultural factors matter. Collectivist cultures may experience more communal climate distress, while individualistic cultures frame it more as personal anxiety. The psychological challenge involves maintaining appropriate concern motivating pro-environmental behavior while avoiding paralyzing despair or defensive denial. Emotional responses can motivate constructive action, activism, lifestyle changes, political engagement, or can overwhelm, generating avoidance or cynicism. Research suggests that combining realistic threat acknowledgement with concrete efficacy, specific actions individuals can take, produces the most adaptive emotional outcomes. Understanding climate-related emotions as rational responses rather than pathological symptoms can reduce stigma while channeling distress toward constructive engagement. The emotional dimensions require addressing alongside the scientific and political aspects of climate response. Fact 99. The emotional wisdom of laughter. Joy's contagious expression. Laughter represents a powerful emotional phenomenon serving multiple functions beyond humor response, with deep evolutionary roots predating human language. Spontaneous laughter occurs 30 times more frequently during social interaction than solitary contexts, revealing its primary function as social bonding mechanism rather than mere humor response. The contagious nature of laughter, difficulty resisting when others laugh, reflects neural mirror systems synchronizing group members' emotional states. This contagion serves affiliation functions, creating shared positive experiences that strengthen relationships. Neuroscience reveals laughter activates reward circuitry including ventral striatum and triggers endorphin release that elevates pain thresholds, explaining the pleasurable feelings and potential therapeutic effects. The respiratory patterns during laughter, repeated forceful exhalations, produce physiological stress reduction through activating parasympathetic nervous system. Distinct laugh types exist. Genuine Duchenne laughter, involving both vocal and facial components including crow's feet eye wrinkles, versus social, non-Duchenne laughter, primarily controlled consciously for politeness. The former activates different neural patterns and produces stronger social bonding. Individual differences in laugh frequency correlate with extroversion and relationship satisfaction. Cultural variation exists in laughter norms. Some cultures encourage frequent laughter while others value restraint, though all human societies laugh. The sophistication of humor triggering laughter, detecting incongruity, experiencing surprise, achieving resolution, requires complex cognitive processing recruiting widespread neural networks. However, infants laugh before developing sophisticated cognition, suggesting laughter's ancient origins in play and affiliation rather than intellectual humor. The therapeutic potential has spawned interventions from laughter yoga to humor-based therapy showing modest mental health benefits. The involuntary nature of genuine laughter makes it an honest signal of positive emotion, explaining its role in mate attraction, friendship formation, and trust development. Understanding laughter illuminates how humans created sophisticated cognitive capacities, complex humor appreciation, built upon ancient emotional expressions serving basic social bonding functions, demonstrating the layered evolution characterizing human emotional life. Fact 99. The emotional wisdom of laughter. Joy's contagious expression. Laughter represents a powerful emotional phenomenon serving multiple functions beyond humor response, with deep evolutionary roots predating human language. Spontaneous laughter occurs 30 times more frequently during social interaction than solitary contexts, revealing its primary function as social bonding mechanism rather than mere humor response. The contagious nature of laughter, difficulty resisting when others laugh, reflects neural mirror systems synchronizing group members' emotional states. This contagion serves affiliation functions, creating shared positive experiences that strengthen relationships. Neuroscience reveals laughter activates reward circuitry including ventral striatum and triggers endorphin release that elevates pain thresholds, explaining the pleasurable feelings and potential therapeutic effects. The respiratory patterns during laughter, repeated forceful exhalations, produce physiological stress reduction through activating parasympathetic nervous system. Distinct laugh types exist. Genuine Duchenne laughter, involving both vocal and facial components including crow's feet eye wrinkles, versus social, non-Duchenne laughter, primarily controlled consciously for politeness. The former activates different neural patterns and produces stronger social bonding. Individual differences in laugh frequency correlate with extroversion and relationship satisfaction. Cultural variation exists in laughter norms. Some cultures encourage frequent laughter while others value restraint, though all human societies laugh. The sophistication of humor triggering laughter, detecting incongruity, experiencing surprise, achieving resolution, requires complex cognitive processing recruiting widespread neural networks. However, infants laugh before developing sophisticated cognition, suggesting laughter's ancient origins in play and affiliation rather than intellectual humor. The therapeutic potential has spawned interventions from laughter yoga to humor-based therapy showing modest mental health benefits. The involuntary nature of genuine laughter makes it an honest signal of positive emotion, explaining its role in mate attraction, friendship formation, and trust development. Understanding laughter illuminates how humans created sophisticated cognitive capacities, complex humor appreciation, built upon ancient emotional expressions serving basic social bonding functions, demonstrating the layered evolution characterizing human emotional life.